Today, we're going to cover some of the caving and cave diving disasters that we have covered on this channel. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like this. New Mexico's Boy Scout Troop 108 entered Fort Stanton Cave on a warm morning in June 2003. The cave was challenging, but the first few hours of the trip went smoothly until the troop took a wrong turn. They didn't realize the route had changed until it was too late. The new route was too difficult, and in their haste to exit the cave, 14-year-old Riley Walker slipped. Rescuers from across the state joined forces to get him out of the cave, but would they get there in time to save him from his gruesome injuries? Find out as we explore the Fort Stanton Cave Rescue. As promised, I will be giving a shout out to our top subscribers. I truly appreciate everyone who participated and showed their support. In fact, I've decided to extend the shout out to the top 5 subscribers instead of just 3. I've included links to their channels in the description below. Please check them out, subscribe, and support these fantastic creators. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest content. Now, let's dive into the video. Fort Stanton Cave is located near the Sacramento Mountains beneath the Snowy River Cave National Conservation Area. This park was created back in 2009 to preserve the karst formations of the cave system below ground. In 1855, a group of soldiers found the cave and named it after the nearby military base that was created to defend settlers who were part of the Manifest Destiny movement, which sparked an influx of travelers moving to the West Coast along paths like the Oregon Trail. Fort Stanton Cave is a monstrous cave. In 2019, a team of professionals found 6 miles of new passages deep underground. And just last year, 2 more miles of the cave were surveyed, which makes the cave an astonishing 44.3 miles long. The Fort Stanton Cave system contains the largest continuous cave formation in the world, the white calcite layer formed on the riverbed of the Snowy River Passage. Despite having a world record, the cave still has more secrets for splunkers to uncover. Cavers still haven't reached a terminal point of the cave. Without an end in sight, cavers from all over the world continue to run scientific expeditions to uncover what lies in the shadows of Fort Stanton Cave. The cave's unique history and challenging interior made it the perfect place for the Boy Scouts to test their mettle. The team entered the first gate at Fort Stanton and were immediately faced with some choices. The scout leaders already mapped their journey, but the team could go into Hellhole number 2, they could go down the winding Bat Cave, left into the Hell of 1,000 Pinches, or forward into the deeper cave. They ignored these side passages and passed by Russell's Crawl as well as they entered the main corridor. The first miles of the cave have low-hanging ceilings, forcing the team of novice cavers to crawl on their hands and knees or on their stomachs through tight claustrophobic tunnels. Traversing around rough corners, the team braced themselves for upcoming steep, muddy slopes that could easily cause a fall. The kids with lighter body weights could almost slide down the slopes without much trouble, but the adults had to balance their weight to avoid straining their ankles. They reached Devil's Backbone, an area with large boulders they had to navigate around and over top of to continue onward. After another bend, they reached 20 Steps, which splits into another junction. One route takes them through the Big Bend to a loop that leads further into the cave's miles-long maze. The other direction is the more common route, and the route Troop 108 chose to take. Through the Crystal Crawl, the boys met another triangular room. One way led to a large hall, and the other led to the Decoration Passage. The Decoration Passage opened into larger tunnels filled with beautiful karst formations. The group marveled at the cave's wonders and pushed forward to the Rose Bowl room and into a large, collapsed chamber. This breakdown passage connected to the lake room up above, and by maneuvering through the rubble, the team reached the lower breakdown passage to continue their journey. This breakdown passage connected to the lake room up above, and by maneuvering through the rubble, the team reached the lower breakdown passage to continue their journey. This area required some tricky maneuvering down wet rocks and through narrow squeezes with sharp edges. Thankfully, the boys were small enough to fit through the constricted tunnels without much trouble. Next, they encountered the Keyhole Gate. Park officials imply that they added multiple gates at different distances to prevent cavers from wandering down unexplored passages. though some have speculated these barred passages lead to secretive compounds used by the military for it above ground. After all, the first nuclear detonation in history was the Trinity test conducted at New Mexico's own Alamogordo Range. And following the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, all nuclear tests had to be conducted underground to limit the spread of radioactive dust through the air. The boys didn't know about these dark conspiracies, so they kept exploring, none the wiser. The scouts climbed past the keyhole gate and the platter room into yet another large chamber with stunning rooms extending from all directions. From the Hall of Velvet, the troop could access some of Fort Stanton's most famous formations, including the Sand Passage, the Gypsum Hall, and the Helictite Hall. They made it to this area in the early afternoon. After taking notes and quizzing each other on the crystals and strange formations in the cave, the team turned around to head home. But that's when their happy adventure turned into a hellish nightmare. Just past the keyhole gate in the three-way hill room, the team took the wrong path. Instead of walking through the trophy room into the lower breakdown passage, they took a right and went into Satan's shoe fly and the hell hole. The hell hole is a 1,700-foot-long narrow passage that can easily trap unskilled adult cavers. The adults realized they took a wrong turn because nothing in the cave had been this difficult, but they continued pushing forward. This passage had tight crawls that exit into steep drops with mud at the bottom, essentially death traps for any unskilled cavers, and nearly everyone here was unskilled. 14-year-old Riley Walker was slowly climbing down one of the tunnels in the hellhole when his foot slipped. Parts of the passage were so tight, people could let go, and the walls of the cave would pin them in place. In order to progress, they'd have to push themselves down. But here, the tunnel opened up just enough to let him slide straight down. He wasn't even close to the bottom. Riley bounced around the side of the rocky tube and fell 20 feet straight down. The scout troop was well prepared for the journey, and Walker was decked out in all the right gear to tackle the cave's difficult challenges. But knee and elbow pads wouldn't save him from this fall. The thick padding of his clothes couldn't stop the rocks from slicing his skin as he fell through the tunnel. After crashing to the floor, his fellow scouts and the leaders rushed to him. His nose was smashed, his ankle was twisted, he had cuts on his face, hands, and up his arms, and his leg had a huge gash. His friends reeled at the sight. They could see the fibers of his muscles frayed beneath his skin, and blood so red it looked black as it flowed from the wound. Half the team split to go back down Satan's shoe fly and out through the way they came. They'd get help while the rest of the team stayed with Walker. The team with Walker quickly tried to constrict his leg by wrapping clothing around his thigh. This would hopefully slow the bleeding, but it could damage his nerves, and it wasn't guaranteed to save him. The rest of the team found a gate and reached the surface. The park team gave the scouts a paper with contact info in case of an emergency. If the team called the police, the dispatch would have to call cave rescue teams. Calling these numbers would cut out the middleman. After calling multiple numbers, local first responders arrived at Fort Stanton's entrance below the nearby road. Police, firefighters, and paramedics all arrived along with volunteers from a local caving club that knew Fort Stanton like the back of their hands. Roughly 2 hours after the accident, the first rescuers reached Walker. But the rescue was far from over. He was lying on the cold, hard surface of the cave around 2 miles from the entrance. The rescuers thought he was in the easy passages. Getting him out through the hellhole would be difficult. The first rescuers split up. Some stayed to wait for medics to arrive, and others left Walker to contact state agencies and the Southwestern Regional Coordinator to initiate a full-scale rescue. The coordinator was now in charge of saving Walker's life. He called multiple cave rescue teams all across New Mexico. People left their jobs and ran to their cars to speed across the highway and rescue the fallen scout. An hour after Walker was located, the medics reached him. They gave him painkillers and cut away the ripped cloth that was stuck to his open wounds. They cleaned the cuts with antibiotics and rubbing alcohol and tried to stop the bleeding by applying a tourniquet. Outside, the coordinator split the rescuers into teams. One team would bring equipment and supplies into the cave to aid the medics, give food to the rescuers, and provide the rescuers with anchors and ropes needed for the extraction. Another team was tasked with laying telephone wires so that the team could communicate using rugged, military-grade field phones. The third team would actually rig the lines needed to bring Walker out of the cave, since he couldn't walk with his injuries. Each team contained 6 caving experts, and after 3 hours of work, 3 more teams were added to the mix. Over 50 rescuers came to save the Boy Scout from Fort Stanton Cave. There was no flood or breakdown yet, but the rescuers were still racing against time to save Walker. His blood loss could easily lead to permanent injuries, or even death. New Mexico has a hot, dry climate, but the tunnels below ground can get extremely cold. Temperatures in Fort Stanton Cave average around the lower 50s. That might not sound too bad. Walking outside for a few minutes in that weather is no problem for most people, but hours of unrelenting exposure wears down even the toughest spirits. Plus, the human body doesn't have to be below freezing for it to freeze to death. Although the rescue was a textbook example of what rescuers needed to do in these high-pressure situations, they were still taking way too long to save him. A little after midnight, the crew had rigged enough line to attempt the next step of the rescue. They had to get Walker out of the hellhole. Rescuers wrapped Walker in a rugged stretcher with solid backs and sides so that the rocks wouldn't cut into him as the stretcher slid along the jagged floor. Rescuers started pulling the ropes, and Walker's stretcher scraped along the narrow tunnels. Hours later, at 2 a.m., the stretcher emerged from the hellhole. The crews reapplied the pain meds and fixed his wounds again, but the rescue wasn't over yet. The rescuers attached the Boy Scout to new ropes and hooked their own harness to the stretcher. Rescuers lined the sides of the stretcher and held onto it for dear life. In unison, they each stood up with the stretcher and began walking him through the open tunnels of the cave. It took the team 5 more hours to reach the first gate, but by 7:30 a.m., 15 hours after the accident, Walker made it out of Fort Stanton Cave. He was loaded into an ambulance, and he later recovered from his injuries. Fort Stanton Cave is now closed to the public, and even novice cavers can't gain entry. Bell Island is a small island in Newfoundland, the easternmost province in Canada. In 2007, mostly outside of the public spotlight, the island witnessed one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of underwater cave diving, and one of the sport's most shocking deaths. This is the story of the ill-fated international mission to explore Bell Island's abandoned mines. The story begins decades earlier. Around the turn of the 20th century, Bell Island became an invaluable resource thanks to its large deposits of iron ore. Mining companies, such as the Nova Scotia Steel and Coal Company, developed a major mining site on the island. They called the site Wabena. Even today, Wabena remains the main settlement on the island, and it's where the vast majority of its residents live. Bell Island and its Wabena mine reached arguably their peak of international importance during World War II. The Allies heavily protected the island, and it was even attacked by German submarines in 1942. This unsuccessful attack would go on to be known as the Battle of Bell Island. After World War II, the island experienced a steep economic decline. By April of 1966, all of Bell Island's mine shafts were closed. Although the island remains densely populated, its population has been slowly decreasing ever since. In the early 2000s, Newfoundland's Department of Tourism knew that something had to be done to remedy the province's enduring economic woes. Opening Bell Island's abandoned mines and underwater shipwrecks to international tourism was one of the ideas put forward. But, in order to potentially open them to the general public, the sites first had to be explored and analyzed by professionals. No one had visited the shipwrecks or traveled down the closed mine shafts in decades. Local officials knew that to ensure the safety and security of visitors, they needed expert assistance. This takes us to the formation of the mission. In the summer of 2004, the Bell Island Heritage Society granted permission to a select team of international divers to begin exploring the Bell Island mine. They were Eric Van Dorn, Steve Lewis, Debbie Stanley, and her husband Rick Stanley. Steve Lewis, who later wrote a book about the mission, describes their first dive as, quote, nothing more than a quick splash. Their goal at this early stage was to find out if diving the abandoned mine was even possible to begin with. They were given an old map from back when the mine was still in use. The map covered several square kilometers of underground tunnels and chambers. In theory, the mine should still look roughly the same as the old map, but at the time, nobody knew. There could have been major cave-ins, or there could be prohibitively poor visibility, or blockades. There was only one way to find out. After meeting at the entrance to the long-abandoned mine, the group strapped on all their equipment, including heavy-duty cave lights for each cave diver, and, perhaps after saying a quick prayer, they plunged into the cold, uncharted darkness. Lewis describes what they saw on that first dive as a, quote, dusty museum. The long, gradually downsloping tunnel that had previously been traversed by minecarts was now filled with water. This tunnel was designated by the map as the number 2 shaft. Lewis and his fellow explorers swam down the number 2 shaft, descending many meters in no time. They soon reached an intersection and turned left, discovering what looked to Lewis like a stable for horses, now eerily submerged and ghostly empty. The group also came across tons of machinery and tools. They even found a pair of boots. Haunted but intrigued by their findings, the group eventually made their way back out of the mine and onto dry land. Stunned, they slowly lumbered uphill with their heavy equipment. Rick Stanley began going on excitedly about how the mine was spectacular, that there was stuff everywhere, that it was fantastic, and that he needed a rum. Above water, at the main staging area, there was another large map of the mine on the wall. Lewis says they traced the distance they had covered and found that it was, in his words, quote, a tiny L-shaped squiggle. Despite all they had already seen, the group had barely even begun to explore the extent of this enormous underwater museum. One thing was clear to everybody involved. Further exploration was definitely warranted. In light of the promising success of their initial mission, Lewis and the others were soon joined by a team of divers and surface support volunteers. Having proven the mine was indeed diveable, at least for professionals, the next mission involved 12 divers total. Steve Lewis was chosen to be the leader of this larger, more thorough expedition. On February 1st, 2007, the team began what was intended to be a 10-day series of dives throughout the Bell Island mine. Lewis, along with underwater photographer Vlada Dakina, went in first. Initially, the mine was exactly how Lewis remembered it. But upon descending further, visibility started to worsen. Thick silt the color of iron ore began obscuring their surroundings. Lewis describes it as having been, quote, almost like a blizzard seen through a car's windshield in winter. The walls of the mine began slowly disappearing. Next, the floor and the wires began to fade. Even with their cave lights, it got darker and darker. Then, Lewis says, Vlada herself disappeared. This abruptly halted the pair in place. After a harrowing moment or two to get their bearings, the pair decided to continue on, even if, for Vlada, there could be little chance of any useful photographs. Their gamble paid off. The silt eventually cleared as they moved on. The team would later discover that snowmelt from the surface formed a muddy underground river, and this had been the source of their sudden lack of visibility. While ultimately not an issue, it was perhaps the first time that Lewis and the team had encountered unsettling danger in the Bell Island mine. It would not be the last. Although slightly shaken, Steve Lewis, Vlada Dakina, and the rest of the team were excited that the mission was now officially underway. In the coming days, underwater visibility improved. The team soon uncovered a seemingly endless list of underwater marvels. The mine proved to be, as indicated by the old maps, a vast subterranean network of tunnels, galleries, and rooms. The rooms varied in size, from claustrophobically cramped to dozens of meters across. The team also kept finding artifact after artifact, mostly disused tools and pieces of machinery. They also found numerous personal items belonging to mine workers of decades past. They even found spots along the wall where mine workers had used lampblack to write things. These literal cave drawings, which hadn't been seen for at least 50 years, included cartoons, messages, and even memorials for dead workers. Halfway through the 10-day expedition, things were going very well. The dive team continued to make progress exploring and assessing the mine's conditions. It was looking like Bell Island would indeed have an opportunity to open as a tourist adventure attraction, and an incredible one at that. On February 5th, 2007, 2 team members were making their joint way through the mine collecting data. Divers on the mission always traveled in pairs as part of safety protocol. One of them was 51-year-old Joseph Steffen. Steffen was the only American on the mission. Therefore, he was the only one in the group who cared that, back in the US, Super Bowl 41 was currently underway. He was looking forward to getting back to the hotel that evening and hopefully catching an overseas broadcast of the game. At one point, Steffen turned to his dive partner, who happened to be one of the diving safety officers on the mission. He indicated that he would like to return to the surface, but alone. That was strange. It was strictly against protocol for diving partners to split up for any amount of time. According to Steve Lewis, Joe Steffen was an experienced cave diver. He was also ex-military and a career cop. At the time that he made the suggestion that he surface alone, Steffen also still had plenty of air in his tanks. So, what could realistically go wrong in this scenario? Of all the daunting and dangerous tasks that were assigned to this exploratory group, simply swimming back out of the number 2 mine shaft into daylight was probably the easiest. No silt, no tight passageways, and virtually no chance of getting lost. Just swim straight toward the opening. No one at the time saw much of any issue with Joe Steffen making his way out of the mine alone, even though it was technically against protocol. But then, Steffen never surfaced. Baffled and horrified, several team members, including leader Steve Lewis, dove into the number 2 shaft. There, they quickly found Steffen. He was only about 300 feet away from the entrance, at a depth of roughly 50 feet. They motioned to Steffen to get his attention, but got no response. Stunningly, he was unconscious. Lewis and the others carried Steffen's cold, wet body up to the surface. He was rushed to a nearby hospital. A young doctor, who Lewis sympathetically guessed was probably just out of medical school, soon entered the hallway with a clipboard in his hand. With sad eyes, he told Lewis and the others, all of whom were in complete disbelief, that although they had tried everything, they had been unable to save Steffen's life. He was gone. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, this promising diving expedition had taken a severely dark and twisted turn. But what made it even more stunning was the fact that Steffen's sudden death seemed completely impossible to explain. Steffen had somehow met his demise within sight of the exit. He had been swimming through a wide, straight tunnel with plenty of air in his tanks and years of experience under his belt. What possibly could have happened that stopped Steffen in his tracks so close to safety? As fellow divers, friends, and family all grieved, they also awaited the results of Steffen's autopsy. Perhaps some explanation, some answers, some way to make sense of what happened would be found. A few days later, the results came in. And while they definitely shed light on the nature of Steffen's death, they were far from resolving the whole mystery. The autopsy revealed that Steffen had suffered an arterial gas embolism. This is a condition almost exclusive to underwater divers. It is related to an infamous condition popularly known as the bends. When a diver suffers an arterial gas embolism, it means that a nitrogen bubble has appeared inside one of their arteries and blocked it. Still, this was surprising, given that Joe Steffen had only been about 50 feet deep when the embolism apparently struck. How could this have happened to such an experienced and competent diver? Beyond that, why did it happen? Why did Steffen suddenly wish to return to the surface in the first place? Why did he insist on doing it alone? Had something gone wrong? Tortuously, His friends and colleagues realized that they would probably never know the answers to these questions. After the bewildering death of Joseph Stephan, the diving team made their sorrowful way back to the hotel. The idea was floated that, in honor of Stephan, the group should all watch the Super Bowl together. It was a touching idea, but according to Steve Lewis, they just weren't in the right state of mind to watch a festive sports game. Instead, they chose another fitting tribute to their fallen friend. They sat around the fireplace and watched Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. That night, many voiced a concern about whether or not the diving mission should continue. Some felt it would be disrespectful to do so, but many others, including Joseph Stephan's wife, Jennifer, felt that Joseph would want the mission to continue. He would want the rest of the mine to be thoroughly explored, and the goal of approving it for tourism to be achieved, even if in his absence. So that is what the team decided to do. As snow threatened to begin falling any minute on Bell Island, Steve Lewis and the remaining team members headed out the very next morning, put their gear back on, and re-entered the mine. Over the next 5 days, the team completed exploring the Bell Island mine. It proved in the end to be even more wondrous and intriguing than any had anticipated. But now, there was another adjective that also applied: deadly. News reporters naturally became much more interested in the exploration of the mine after hearing news of Joseph Stephan's death. The idea that a mine, which had taken the life of a professional diver, was being considered as an open tourist attraction understandably raised some eyebrows. But ultimately, the mission was successful. Today, the newly drained number 2 shaft at Bell Island Mine is open to the general public. Instead of donning diving gear and plunging into a murky abyss, visitors young and old strap on hard hats and walk along pathways laid out by Steve Lewis, Joe Stephan, and the rest of that brave dive team back in 2007. The work they did allowed the disused, largely forgotten site to become a place of education, the honoring of history, and best of all, tourism revenue for the region. The Lost River Cave sounds like a place from an Indiana Jones movie. It also looks like one. Let's face it, there aren't a whole lot of caves on this planet that you can explore on a boat, or that have been featured by Ripley's Believe It or Not. It's a unique place great for families to visit, but it also boasts a dramatic history and, on rare occasions, has even turned deadly. Lost River Cave is located in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Bowling Green is the 3rd largest city in Kentucky, but the nearest big city to it is actually Nashville, Tennessee, since Bowling Green sits quite close to Kentucky's southern border. Aside from this cave, the biggest thing Bowling Green is probably known for is the National Corvette Museum. It's not really a place that draws millions of visitors every tourist season. The existence of Lost River Cave within its city limits is something of an anomaly. Most cities don't get to have such an unusual natural landmark just a few minutes away from the local shopping mall. The entrance to Lost River Cave, which is literally across the street from a Popeye's chicken restaurant, is among the largest cave entrances in the eastern United States. The cave itself is really a cave system, which stretches out for 7 miles underground. As the name suggests, the cave has a fairly wide river running through it. For a long time, the river was also thought to be insanely deep. When geologists first began trying to measure the depth of the water, they used something called a plumb bob, a small, pointed weight on the end of a string. Although I haven't read any direct accounts of this, there's a good chance that the first time they tried it, they ran out of string. They didn't need just a few feet of it, or even just a few dozen feet of it. To their surprise, geologists ended up needing hundreds of feet of string to measure the depth of the Lost River. After some adjustments to their string supply, they finally managed to get the plumb bob to hit what they thought was the bottom of the river, at an astonishing 437 feet below the surface. They were measuring at a section called the Blue Hole. Blue holes are essentially sinkholes, and they appear in other places around the world, such as the Bahamas and the South China Sea. The fact that there was a blue hole inside a cave in the middle of the US that appeared to be nearly 450 feet deep helped catapult Lost River Cave to international fame. In fact, this extraordinary depth was the main reason why Lost River Cave ended up being featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not. But, disappointingly, readers should have chosen not to believe this one. It was later discovered that these insane measurements were wildly inaccurate. But they were wildly inaccurate for an interesting reason. The blue hole in Lost River Cave actually connects to another river, one that runs underground, so technically the blue hole is only 16 feet deep. The Plum Bob was just getting swept underground, making it seem like it kept descending and descending. This was a clever trick by Lost River Cave. No one seemed to figure it out until long after it had become a famous tourist destination, and many are still on the fence about the true depth. This apparently includes the government of Kentucky, whose Energy and Environment Cabinet still says on its website that the blue hole's depth is supposedly 437 feet. No matter how deep it is, the blue hole is still an amazing feature of the cave, and it's not the only reason the cave is an amazing place to visit. Today, on a boat, it takes roughly a half hour to tour the whole cave, because that's how much there is to see and explore inside. The cave also has a fascinating history to learn about. People were storing food and using the cave for shelter as long as 10,000 years ago. Around the turn of the 19th century, a watermill was built here, and, for a long time, it was the only underground watermill in the United States. During the Civil War, Bowling Green was Kentucky's provisional capital as part of the Confederacy. During the Union Army takeover, Union soldiers used the cave as a camp, as many as 40,000 of them. According to local archaeologists, you can still see the names of Union soldiers carved into the walls. My favorite part of the Lost River Cave story is what happened during Prohibition. According to local legend, although this has never been proven, the cave was used by bootleggers to make alcohol illegally. After Prohibition, and this part we know for sure, the cave was turned into a nightclub. Yeah, no joke, a nightclub. The club hosted a number of famous musical acts, including the NBC Orchestra. Billboard described it as the only air-conditioned nightclub at the time because it was so naturally cool inside. For reasons that could only have to do with the general public being no fun, the club went out of style and closed in the 1960s. The cave went into a period of decline, filling with trash. It wasn't until the 1990s that an effort was made to refurbish the cave and open it for tourism. Paying to take a boat tour is generally the way most people experience Lost River Cave today. However, there are those who try and explore the cave alone. You're not supposed to do this. The property is privately owned, so you have to avoid getting caught just to get inside. Despite the obvious intrigue, I, of course, cannot recommend that anybody try this. Not only is it dangerous, it's also illegal. But I can tell you the story of what happened when one man tried to do it. His name was Danny L. Vaughn Jr. Danny grew up in Warren County, the same county where Bowling Green is. He was born in 1990 and spent 30 years of his life living near Lost River Cave before he seemingly decided enough was enough. He was going to try and explore the cave. I say this in speculation. As far as I've been able to uncover, nobody really knows for sure what Danny's motivation was. Danny reached the age of 30 during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Stores were closed, families were forced to stay home. Needless to say, tours of Lost River Cave were canceled indefinitely, and there was no way, at least no legal way, to get in. Danny had a daughter. He also had a decent-sized family full of siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins. There's no real way to know, but I think we can safely assume Danny's experience of COVID-19 was much like it was for most people. Stressful, tragic, highly disruptive, and after a while, full of boredom and restlessness. I guarantee you, Danny L. Vaughn Jr. is not the only person in Warren County who thought about sneaking into Lost River Cave during lockdown. What sets Danny apart is that it appears he went out and actually tried to do it. As I described earlier, one of the many things that makes Lost River Cave unique is its central location. As a matter of fact, it is right off the side of the highway. This poses both advantages and disadvantages for sneaking in. For a massive cave with a 7-mile river inside it, the place is remarkably easy to get to. You could even stop across the highway at Lost River Liquors and grab some beer on your way in. Being right next to the highway is also pretty ideal for making a quick getaway if needed. At the same time, being in such a central location means there are people around most of the time. Of course, due to COVID, there were no tours happening and the cave itself was empty, but the whole surrounding area wasn't. Danny may have planned meticulously for this, or he may have had no plan at all. None of us really have any idea. All we know is that there was at least one witness to the event. At around 6:30 p.m. on March 11, 2020, Danny L. Vaughn Jr. was seen climbing over the fence and entering Lost River Cave. The witness who saw him called the police immediately. Why they were so quick to call the authorities must have one of two possible explanations. The first is that the person called because they saw Danny fall into the water. This would explain why they were so quick to dial 911. They thought he had an accident and was probably hurt. The second explanation is that the person who called was simply calling because he was trespassing and they wanted to report it. This begs the question of whether Danny fell or not. Frustratingly, local news reports seem to conflict on this. The local NBC station reported that officials on the scene said Danny jumped over the fence and fell into the river. But the local ABC station quoted an officer named Tim Gray, who said, "We don't know if the individual jumped or fell from the fence, but we are aware of witnesses who did see him climb over the fence and did not see him resurface." Well, which is it? I've never been to Lost River Cave, but based on the multitude of photographs and video footage available online, I have not seen anything I would describe as a fence. There are certain sections inside the cave where there are railings, low metal beams along the river's edge. But there doesn't appear to be a fence that a witness from outside the cave could see Danny climbing over. But in May 2020, there might have been a temporary fence blocking entry to the cave, which had been shut down due to COVID just a month earlier. If I had to guess, that's probably what Danny climbed over and what the witness reported to the police. If that's true, it means Danny most likely didn't fall. He was just obviously sneaking in. What Danny got up to while he was in there is something we'll never know. The sad and mysterious ending to the story is that he somehow drowned in the river. If you frame the story like it was a madman who leapt over the fence, fell, and drowned, well, then it doesn't sound so peculiar. But if you dig a little deeper, as I think you and I have, we see that it probably wasn't that simple. Danny probably didn't fall. And if he had fallen, he wouldn't have landed in the water, because he was probably climbing over a temporary fence that was blocking the opening of the cave, which is a bit of a distance from where the river actually sits. But how did Danny drown? Most of the river is only 4 or 5 feet deep. Sure, it's supposedly possible to drown in an inch of water, but if you're a full-grown male with enough physical agility to leap over a fence, how likely is it that, sadly, like so many cases, with this, we simply don't have enough information? It's possible no one does. Besides the witness who called the police, and according to Officer Gray only saw him until he passed over the fence, no one saw Danny again until his body was recovered from the water. Was he a thrill seeker looking for an escape amid the stress and confinement imposed by COVID restrictions? Was he suffering a nervous breakdown? Did he somehow fall or hurt himself in the water in such a way that he couldn't swim or even stand up in the shallow river? Or did something else happen? What do you think happened? Three years after the world-famous Tam Luang cave rescue in Thailand, a monk named Phra Adran Manas entered Tam Phra Sanyam, or the Cave of the Monk, to pray. He entered the cave alone. He wasn't a skilled caver, and he wasn't equipped with the proper gear. Then, a storm swept through the sky, flooding the cave from all of its entrances, and Thailand cavers joined forces to rescue him. Could rescuers reach him in time? And would any unlucky cavers die trying to save him? Find out as we follow the story of the rescue inside the Cave of the Monk. Tam Phra Sanyam is located beneath the massive Tung Sulang Luyang National Park, which covers over 480 square miles of gorgeous forests. The park opens to a vast savanna with tree-spotted plateaus that are home to 110 different species of birds. The park has campgrounds and other hiking attractions like the Sidit Waterfall and the Kang Sofa Waterfall, and it's situated above rocky ground containing slate and limestone, making it the perfect place for caves to form. Thanks to these conditions, Thailand's longest cave, the Tam Phra Wang Deng, is also found beneath this park. The tall, mountain-like plateaus in the park are actually formed by tectonic activity. They're considered karstic formations, like the structures found inside caves. The natural beauty of these landmarks was threatened by mining activities for a time, until the Thai government recognized that the caves had significant cultural value, and rules were enacted to protect the caves. Tam Phra Sanyam roughly translates to the Cave of the Monk owning the nice side tree. One of its entrances is located next to a small temple against the side of a cliff. This entrance is a resurgence, which means water from the upstream Tam Dao River exits from the cave system at this hole in the rock. During some parts of the year, the broader cave system can't be accessed from the Cave of the Monk because the water flowing out of the resurgence is too strong. One day, the subject of this story, Fra Manas, walked across the deck and climbed down a bamboo ladder to enter the cave through the resurgence, otherwise known as the fossil entrance, a craggy hole in the side of the plateau. This entrance connects directly to the main subterranean stream that cuts through the cave. Inside its foreboding mouth, the Cave of the Monk has a large chamber with dripping stalactites and smooth waves of rock looming overhead. The floor is full of pebbles and sand in this first section. Downstream, the water has had less time to alter the shape of the cave, so large boulders dot the ground instead of small stones. The water here is stagnant, and small holes in the floor can sneak up on unsuspecting adventurers. These passages open into tall vertical sections where erosion created new pathways down into the main stream. The cave then connects to a sandy floor with low ceilings where cavers have to crawl to exit the Cave of the Monk. Like his forefathers before him, Fra Manas walked through the damp cave further into the darkness. For centuries, Buddhist monks have ventured into caves to meditate. The practice of meditation is all about focusing the mind, so caves provide tranquil locations that are isolated from the outside world. Their all-encompassing darkness is terrifying to most people. Cave tours will occasionally turn off the lights to show visitors how soul-crushing and disorienting total darkness can really be. But monks like Manas welcome the darkness because it enhances their meditation. Fra Manas doesn't reside at the local temple outside the Cave of the Monk. Instead, he takes a pilgrimage to the cave every year in April. The local villagers knew Manas and welcomed his arrival. They fed him and asked him to impart any spiritual knowledge he had uncovered from the year prior. The next morning, on Saturday, April 3rd, 2021, Manas found a quiet alcove away from the main stream and began his meditation. As he sat, focusing his mind, freeing his brain of all thought, a nagging sound kept hitting his ears and pulling him out of his trance. The sounds grew louder until he could no longer ignore them. He rose to find the water of the subterranean river was rising, and fast. Outside, a thunderstorm had rolled over the savanna and stagnated. Without winds to carry away the swirling clouds, the storm drenched the park, and the waters ran swiftly across the stony ground directly into Kamphra Sanyam. Since this cave is a resurgent for an underground river, water could flow into the cave from both ends. The entrance that Fra Manas used to get into the cave was being flooded from the outside, while the saturated river sent torrents of water through the cave directly toward his location. Manas looked around in shock as the water surged toward him from both sides. But to his horror, there were more dangers to deal with. Water from tall avens, or potholes, rained on him from above, flooding the cave from a third direction. As the moon rose behind the violent clouds, the villagers noticed that Fra Manas hadn't returned from his meditations. They immediately called the police and rescue services. The local Prasat Ban Saitan cave rescue team was the first to arrive within hours of the call. They immediately began assessing the situation. They quickly geared up and went into the cave, but after only an hour of searching, they had to turn around. The waters were getting too extreme even for those pros. The fossil or resurgence entrance was blocked by the rains. That meant the upstream route would likely be blocked as well. They checked just to be sure, and like they suspected, the waters flowing into the cave were high enough to completely flood the cave at this end. Even the other major exit, which was further away, was also blocked by the waters exiting the cave. Police and firefighters arrived, but they couldn't do anything yet. The next day, the storm showed no signs of stopping. More rescue crews from all across Thailand were arriving. They were all passionate and eager to help the stranded 46-year-old monk, but their hands were tied. Eventually, military personnel arrived, and they considered blasting the third exit to open a wider resurgence. This would divert the stream away from the area where Manas had entered, and it could lower the waters enough for cavers to get inside. But since the cave is considered sacred, many of the cavers protested these drastic measures, even though it could cost the traveling monk his life. Shortly after the rains began their unceasing deluge, the stranded monk fled his secluded spot. To get to safety, he would have to run alongside the river as it crashed along the rocks, splashing over the ground as it rose higher and higher. Even though Vanox wasn't an expert caver, he had been here many times, so he avoided the pitfalls and sprinted across the rocky floor. Then, he summoned all of his strength and climbed to a higher ledge around a quarter-mile from the entrance. The rising waters continuously struck terror into the monk 24/7, but the ever-present threat of drowning wasn't his only problem. As part of his monk training, Vanox was only allowed to eat twice a day, and he couldn't eat after 12 noon. Monks in Thailand generally practice Theravada Buddhism, which allows them to eat meat, though some will choose to stick to a vegetarian or even a vegan diet if possible. However, many monks in Thailand rely solely on donations to survive. That means they have little choice of what they eat or even how much they can eat every day, since donations are divided among the other monks. It's safe to say Vanox was more at risk of starvation than even an average unprepared caver. Usually, cavers will bring some food, like energy bars or trail mix with them, but Vanox was alone in the dark, and his hunger was consuming him. On top of all his other struggles, Vanox faced another unique threat only found in caves deep underground. There were no lights deep below the Thailand park. The cold was numbing his limbs, making it hard to feel, and the sound of the water became almost hypnotic. Short-term exposure to total darkness can be relaxing, but as hours turned to days, Vanox may have been experiencing sensory deprivation. Sensory deprivation occurs when the body has little to no sensory input. In short intervals, sensory deprivation might have therapeutic potential. That's why Vanox was here to begin with, and why thousands of people all over the world elected to seal themselves in metal chambers or flotation devices. But extended time in a low-stimulus environment can cause hallucinations, severe anxiety, and even long-lasting depression. Vanox might have journeyed into the cave of the monk to find peace in his mind, but now his mind was tortured, just like prisoners stuck in solitary confinement. In extreme cases, total darkness and sensory deprivation was even used to torture and interrogate enemies of war. In some ways, Vanox faced even worse conditions than those stuck in a small cage. The rising waters created a panic that lasted for days. He couldn't adapt to his situation. Every step could be another puddle, a fast-moving river, or a bottomless hole that would crush him in a violent death. The delusions brought on by his total isolation began to sway even his hardened mind. Suddenly, flashes of light danced in the periphery of Vanox's vision. He stood up quickly, the blood rushing from his brain, leaving him more lightheaded. He stumbled toward the lights, but they vanished. These lights were like mirages found in the desert, and they were caused by the sensory deprivation he was experiencing. The waters were still too severe for anyone to safely enter the cave from any direction. Rescuers could only wait with the villagers until the rain let up. By Tuesday, the rescue team ballooned as hundreds of people gathered to figure out how to save the stranded monk. Many feared by this point it was most likely a recovery mission for his body. The rain flooded into the cave for not 1, not 2, but 4 days straight. Miraculously, by the 4th day, on Wednesday, the rain finally slowed to a halt. However, some of the cave's entrances were totally submerged in water. 17 rescuers scrambled their diving gear and went into the cave at the resurgence. 50 feet beyond the entrance, they found a flooded sump that led deeper into the cave. This area was totally submerged. If the monk was caught in this divot, he was surely gone. They each strapped into their scuba gear and swam into the murky waters of the cave of the monk. The rescuers deftly maneuvered through the perilous tunnels and surfaced on the other side. This time, the light Vanox saw shining in the waters didn't disappear when he blinked. The rescuers found him. They checked his vitals and saw that he was delirious, but still capable of moving. They gave him a respirator and scuba mask to see underwater, tightened a harness around his waist, and hooked their own ropes to his harness. If the monk lost consciousness or got disoriented, the ropes would ensure he couldn't go too far, and the crew would know exactly how to find him. Some members kept hands on him throughout the swimming portion of the cave until he surfaced on the other side. A short walk later, and Framenas was outside in the fresh air once again. Paramedics checked his vitals as cameras flocked to take photos of the miracle. The monk could walk, but he was still taken to a hospital to recover from the cold. In the safety of the hospital, he could rehydrate and get some much-needed meals before returning to his own monastery and his quiet life as a monk. Thailand keeps making headlines with shocking rescue stories that narrowly avoided tragedy. Sacred or not, Thailand's caves are deadly traps waiting to ensnare unsuspecting visitors who boldly travel in the hellish world buried beneath the Earth's surface. The Sierra Juarez mountain range towers over the majestic land of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. Beneath these tall mountains and lush forests lies the Coffe Cave, an expansive network of tunnels that stretches 47 miles in length with its deepest point tunneling down close to a mile into the earth. The cave's unique structure has challenged explorers for decades, and cavers were convinced it was the deepest cave on Earth. Beyond its challenge, the cave is also home to a number of dark secrets. The Coffe cave system was formally discovered in 1987, but archaeologists have unearthed relics that date back to the year 1250 AD. Scientists found knives that were used to slice open sacrifices before the bodies were sent to the deep abyss of the Coffe cave below. And, on March 1st, 1991, the cave claimed the life of a young caver who wanted to be one of the historical few to brave depths of this mysterious cave. Grab your rappelling gear and get ready to explore the dark history of the Coffe cave. The Coffe Cave, known locally as Cueva Coffe, was first discovered by Carol Vesely and Bill Farr during their Proyecto Papalo expedition project. They originally explored a sinkhole in search of a larger cave. There they found a fissure they dubbed Grita de los Bichos because of the gnats that swarmed them as they first began their descent. Exploring further, they found more fissures that dropped down in stages before reaching another large chasm. The chasm proved too difficult, so they left the area and went to search for larger caves. Carol said to Bill, "Wouldn't it be great to find a really grand Mexican-style entrance?" And right on cue, they discovered the entrance to Cueva Coffe, a 98-feet hole beneath a 22-foot-tall waterfall at the base of a limestone cliff. Carol and Bill went on multiple expeditions and later published their findings in a report from 2001 with the Association for Mexican Cave Studies. The Cueva Coffe cave is the second deepest cave in the Western Hemisphere and the 11th deepest cave in the world. But, while it's not the most impressive on paper, the structure of the cave presents an incredible challenge for any intrepid explorers. Geologists have mapped the cave from the surface and found that it spreads across 47 miles. But by the early 2000s, only 6 miles had been formally explored. 3D mapping of the cave showed that the Coffe cave has 3 distinct levels formed by an underground river. The river began eroding the cave millions of years ago when the cave first formed from the tectonic shift that pushed the Sierra Juarez Mountains up and out of the Gulf of Mexico. The upper layers of the cave are fossil tunnels where the river once flowed through but have since dried up, while the active river courses through the lowest levels of the cave. Although the upper portions aren't easier to traverse, the cave represents a massive challenge for would-be explorers. Close to 2 miles of rope needs to be rigged, and teams of 4 cavers need to transport oxygen tanks, fins, and other heavy scuba equipment close to a mile before reaching the first of 2 underwater sumps. Along the way, early explorers had to establish 3 camps, but later ventures would add another 4 camps in the sprawling abyss. However, the challenges of Cueva Coffe didn't stop people from pushing the limits of cave exploration. In 1988, a fossil site was discovered near Camp 2. The American archaeologist Janet Fitzsimmons led a team alongside the Oaxaca division of the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology and History. Together, they created the Coffe Archaeological Project, which helped map the upper portions of the cave. The team discovered that Cueva Coffe was used for ceremonial sacrifices by the Cuicatec people of Oaxaca. The Cuicatec worship a deity known as the Lord of the Hill, or Señor del Cerro, who they believe resides in Cueva Coffe. They believe the ancient Cuicatec would partake in bloodletting ceremonies to appease the Lord of the Hill and send sacrifices into the mouth of the cave. Fitzsimmons and her team discovered volcanic glass or obsidian sacrificial knives that were thrown into the cave after the ceremonies, and they found other fossils and artifacts like post-classic era ceramic jars filled with jade beads, wooden masks, and buried human remains. But the most important discovery was a turquoise mosaic tablet. Known as the Cueva Coffe tablet, the artifact is split into 4 sections. One quadrant depicts a battle with warriors in alligator and jaguar helmets holding captives by the hair, while other warriors hold prisoners captive. The lower left section contains a snake and beads that represent a date, while the right side of the tablet was unrecoverable due to water damage. The Kweekatech people still exist to this day, with a 2012 census survey estimating the total population at around 13,000 people. On March 1, 1991, one ambitious caver lost his life in the Coffe Cave. A team of explorers ventured into the cave led by 3 veterans, Bill Stone, Matt Oliphant, and Don Coons. They wanted to prove that Cueva Coffe was the deepest cave on the planet, after archaeological teams had given up during their exploration some years prior. The new team had been underground for over a week, and they had also reached their limit, a 4,000 feet vertical shaft that was 7 miles from the cave's entrance. While the veterans tried to tackle this new challenge, Christopher Yeager and Peter Haberland were just entering the cave. Peter was an advanced caver, but Chris had only been exploring caves for 2 years. Cueva Coffe proved challenging even for the veterans, so Chris was bold to attempt the venture. The team nicknamed him the Kid, and he got a 30-minute lecture about the safety of the cave. Learn the routes in smaller sections. Carry only light gear at first, don't explore alone, and stay underground for short periods of time until the body can adapt. Chris started to struggle almost immediately by making a critical mistaking. The 2 most important pieces of gear are lights and a rappel rack, which allows climbers to descend the long vertical shafts of the cave. Chris failed to secure his rappel rack to his harness, and he dropped it. This should have been a clear warning. Get out and try again with more experience. But somehow, Chris and Peter managed to locate the lost rappel rack, and they continued the descent. They immediately experienced another massive red flag when the pair got lost for close to an hour. Peter and Chris relocated the route and spent another 7 hours climbing. Once they reached the next 75 feet vertical drop, Peter went down first, and he stood away from the wall in case Chris kicked down any debris. They were only 20 minutes away from Camp 2 and a much-needed rest. Chris only had to switch his rappel harness to the new rope that would reach to the bottom of this new area. He made the switch and leaned back to add tension, but his harness disconnected from the rappel rack that was still connected to the rope. Peter felt a sudden wind blow past him. Chris fell so fast he didn't have time to scream. Peter turned to find Chris with a broken leg and no pulse. Peter went to the camp to get assistance. The team returned and attempted CPR, but it was too late. Chris's girlfriend, Tina Shirk, learned of the accident shortly after, because she was just minutes away on the same expedition. Chris Yeager was buried in a passage close to the shaft where he fell. A year later, a team of Chris's friends returned to Cueva Coffe and brought his remains to the surface to be properly buried near his family home in Indiana. In spite of the tragedy, further expeditions sought to prove that these Mexican caves were the deepest on Earth, but explorers kept getting stuck in what was dubbed a terminal sump, a closed-off waterway at the bottom of the cave. In 2003, a team from the United States embarked on an expedition to finally explore the Cueva Coffe past the sumps. The first sump was 459 feet long, while the second was almost 1,000 feet long. Between the 2 sumps ran an underground stream which flooded the sumps. With new equipment and more experience than previous explorers, the U.S. team pushed past the 2 sumps and set out to explore more of the Coffe Cave. On the other side, they found that the stream between the sumps fed into 3 underground waterfalls. The largest waterfall was over 196 feet tall, and it ended in a 262 feet long lake. The team had no time to explore the waterfalls, but this discovery would prompt even more journeys into the cave over the next 20 years. The team also found a tunnel that had collapsed years ago, blocking the path forward. In 2017, a team of 12 elite explorers trained in both climbing and diving from the United States Deep Caving Team set out to see if the Cueva Coffe connected to the Cueva de la Mano. If a connection existed, then it would make the Cueva Coffe system the deepest cave ever found. The 2017 Coffe Cave was supported by 65 people from 11 different countries who staged the gear all the way to the first sump. It took this enormous team of support staff a month to set up the route for the 12 specialists. The 12-person team was split into teams of 4 who would spend the next 3 months exploring the depths of Cueva Coffe. 10 weeks into the expedition, they failed to find the connection they were hoping for. But the journey wasn't a total loss. Instead of finding what they were searching for, they found an ascending tunnel in the opposite direction. The team expected the tunnel to be a parallel route or a dead end, but they discovered a drainage divide in a new chamber. This newly discovered area also had strong winds, which was a huge surprise. In 1989, the wind in the known regions of the Cueva Chévet had completely stopped at the location of Camp 3. After this discovery, the team found a new major cave named Juniper CL6. The dimensions they measured in Juniper CL6 didn't match any of the previously known parts of Cueva Chévet, and the explorers theorized that this may be the master cave of the Sierra Juarez Mountains. While the team was eager to explore the new cave, they ran out of rope above a 130 by 130 foot borehole, so they couldn't push any further. The team went back in 2018 to explore the cave now known as Cueva de la Peña Negra, or Cave of the Black Cliff. 3 additional camps were created for this new venture, with a base camp of roughly 4 people who could communicate to all 6 underground camps via a wire Michi phone system that could last hundreds of hours on a single 9-volt battery. The team found 4 connection points to Cueva Chévet, which redefined the upper portion of the cave. The first level is actually just a side passage of the Cave of the Black Cliff. The team also explored half a mile of the deepest section of Cueva Chévet, but they found no additional depth. In 2019, the team returned to explore a section of breakdown near Camp 3. Breakdowns are regions where the cave has collapsed from a variety of possible causes. The area they explored is called the Mad Hatter Breakdown, and they succeeded in pushing past the collapsed rock. Once on the other side, they found another breakdown dubbed Mad Cow. This new area was in a borehole 200 meters above Sump 1, and the new area also had strong wind. Both of these features meant that the team was close to finding the long-sought-after bypass to Sump 1. The team returned in 2021 and succeeded in pushing past Sump 1. There, they found 13 more miles of unexplored tunnels in Cueva Chévet. The majority Cueva Chévet consists of vertical passages, which are wet and difficult to explore, but the new regions past Sump 1 were mostly horizontal. The team discovered a 246-foot-high region known as Harmony Hall, and they continued to explore to a region 1,968 feet below the village of San Miguel Santa Flor. Their efforts are ongoing, and they have 2 goals for 2022: find new entrances near the village of San Miguel Santa Flor and explore more of Peña Negra. That's the story of one of the Chévet Cave, one deepest caves in the world that's home to a history of bloodshed. Who knows what secrets explorers will continue to unearth over the coming years?
Sloan's Valley Cave is a little-known cave system in south-central Kentucky. Despite being little-known, the system does have a small community of rabbit fans. Local officials say that visitors in small numbers come every weekend. In fact, there's even a Facebook community called Sloan's Valley Cavers dedicated to the cave system. What makes the cave so special, and why do so few people know about it? It's a question we'll look to answer as we explore the caves together during this video. But I can tell you one thing. In November of 2006, Sloan's Valley Cave was anything but unknown. In fact, it was the site of a horrific accident that brought it attention from some of the world's largest news outlets. But we'll get to that. First, let's learn a bit more about this cave and where it's located. Sloan's Valley Cave is in a pretty rural area. Kentucky's 2 major cities, Lexington and Louisville, are roughly 100 and 150 miles away, respectively. To get to Sloan Valley, you have to drive down Route 27 and get off the highway somewhere between 10 and 20 miles after you pass through Somerset. Somerset is really the last place along the highway you could reasonably describe as a city. That is, until you eventually cross the border and get to Knoxville, Tennessee, which will take you about another 2 hours. Everything in between, in this roughly 130-mile expanse, is very spread out and mostly forest. The main landmark is the Cumberland River, a major waterway that winds horizontally through the state and provides water for many of the area's residents. So that in itself is one reason why Sloan's Valley Cave so often slips under the radar of the general public. With the exception of about 3 people and maybe a few cows, it's far away. People don't know about it because they simply have no reason to. But another explanation behind the cave's obscurity is the fact that it has such a passionate and small group of fans. Those who know about the cave and treasure it as a beautiful location in nature seem to relish the fact that it is so unknown and so untrammeled by people. Cave enthusiasts worry about vandalism, littering, and other nuisances that would result from the location of the cave becoming common knowledge. While doing the research for this video, I was able to uncover some useful information about the specific area that the cave system is located in, but out of respect for those who want to help preserve the cave, I've decided not to disclose that information here publicly. What I will tell you is that the main entrance to the cave system is located on private property and that it is relatively close to a landfill. That's important, because it means that for decades the property owners have been having problems with pollution at the site, even without the location getting many visitors. Runoff from the landfill has previously been accused of polluting the waters of Lake Cumberland. In the 1990s, the property owners had a pond on their property tested for contamination, and allegedly tried to pursue legal action against the landfill with little success. Although it appears to be fairly clean and well maintained in the photographs I could find, the main entrance to Sloan's Valley Cave is called the Garbage Pit, which can hardly be a coincidence. But even if the name is inspired by an excess of waste trickling into the cave entrance, there's no way the waste could infiltrate the whole cave. And that's because this cave is huge. Sloan's Valley Cave is a 24-mile system that eventually runs into the Cumberland River. Explorers find room after room after room, all full of stalagmites, stalactites, draperies, columns, seemingly any kind of formation that a caving expert could think of. Many stretches of the cave are also quite dangerous. Perhaps the most dangerous, and the one that drew nationwide attention back in 2006, is the stretch called Screaming Willie's. It's not exactly clear who Willie is, but it's definitely clear why he would have been screaming. This is a route to exit the cave, and it is 60 feet of almost completely vertical cave wall. Your reward for successfully scaling the wall is daylight, but most prefer to take an alternate route to exit the cave, leaving Screaming Willies for the real daredevils. Treacherous sections like this, along with the marvelous array of visual features, make this cave a hidden gem for those who know how to find it. Sloan's Valley is particularly appealing to experienced cavers who know how to navigate its complex passages and appreciate its structural diversity. Experienced cavers like Edward Martin. When Edward Martin arrived at the entrance to Sloan's Valley Cave in 2006, it wasn't his first time. At 40 years old, Martin had earned himself something of a reputation for exploring dangerous and daunting places such as caves. Martin actually lived more than 2 hours away in Cincinnati, Ohio, but his attraction to the rugged challenge of an underexplored underground cave was enough to draw him across state lines. In November of 2006, a group of 7 people, including Edward Martin, traveled to the remote location where the entrance to Sloan's Valley Cave can be found. Martin probably would have been the leader of the group. Friends later said that he had been coming to the spot regularly for more than a decade. He would have known every nook, every cranny, every tip and trick for navigating your way down and navigating your way back up again. Now, there's something about this story that makes it notably different from most other stories about caving gone wrong. In most stories, there's either some kind of a malfunction with the equipment or some kind of freak accident that the cavers simply would have never expected. But in the case of Edward Martin and the 6 friends who he took to Sloan's Valley Cave, things were different. They made the decision to free climb. In other words, without ropes. In a 24-mile cave system, that's a pretty bold decision. Inside the cave, you are, of course, in total darkness, save for whatever light source you happen to bring. In south-central Kentucky, in a cave that connects to a major river, you're also in the presence of moisture. The cave even experiences regular flooding, and pools of water are a common encounter. So, it's slippery, it's dark, and it's full of steep walls, long drops, and jagged rock formations. I think it's safe to say that relying solely on the support of your own hands and feet in this place demonstrates extreme confidence and familiarity. Edward Martin must have felt that he had been here so many times and knew the cave so well that it would be no problem to casually explore it without strapping in. That proved to be a fatal mistake. The group entered the cave around 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. Despite what surely must have been some nerve-wracking moments, they were able to successfully explore the cave without ropes for about 2 hours. and they would have had lots to see in that amount of time. After passing through the previously mentioned garbage pit that greets visitors at the cave entrance, cavers descend to reach an enormous space called the lake room. There's an arch in this room high enough for an adult to stand underneath. Crossing this massive room would have been a real challenge without ropes. The floor is usually very silty and it is always steep. Once you traverse the lake room, you move further into the cave towards a distant room called the Oasis. Along the way, you'll see every kind of cave rock formation you can find in a textbook. You also might see bats hanging from the ceiling and albino crawdads swimming in the various pools. 24 miles is more than the distance from downtown Manhattan to past the Bronx. Exploring all of that inside a cave in a single day is quite literally impossible. Martin and his friends seemed content with a casual visit, at least for that day. But as they started making their way back out of the cave, they eventually reached a point of disagreement. 3 people in the group wanted to take the easier route out of the last bit of the cave, which makes particular sense given that they were all working without ropes. But the other 4, including Martin, wanted to brave the 60-foot ascent known as Screaming Willies. Rather than force anyone to go against what they were comfortable with, the group decided they would split up. The 3 would go off and follow the different exit route. Martin and the 3 remaining others would climb up Screaming Willies. Martin volunteered to go last. Now, he may have been the most experienced of the 4, so it's possible he did this so as to offer advice and support to the other 3 who would climb before him. One at a time, they made their harrowing journey up the slope and towards the late afternoon above ground. One at a time, they slowly but surely made it. Finally, all 3 of Martin's fellow cavers had made it to the top. Martin was now the only person in Sloan's Valley Cave, and the only one left who needed to make the climb. He started making his way up the slope. 60 feet is a long, long way in these conditions. With very little light, no safety harness, and nothing but cold, damp rock formations, it's the equivalent of climbing up a 5 or 6 floor apartment building and trying to get to the roof. The relief of making it is hard to imagine, and probably what drives ambitious cavers to attempt it in the first place. But tragically, Screaming Willies had other plans for Edward Martin that November afternoon. At around 20 or 30 feet up the climb, Edward Martin slipped. All at once he went crashing and tumbling down, hitting rocks along the way, and eventually landed on his head and shoulders against the cave floor. His 3 friends who were waiting for him at the top must have heard this happen, and it would have been immediately obvious that 911 needed to be called as fast as humanly possible. The local county sheriff's office received a distress call at exactly 6:36 p.m. that evening. From the moment the call was put in, it would be about 3 additional hours before 40-year-old Edward Martin would be pronounced dead. His cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, which he suffered during the fall. According to the chief deputy coroner, people were known to suffer injuries in Sloan's Valley Cave. Others were known to get lost in its enormous expanse of channels and caverns. But to his knowledge, Edward Martin was the first and only person to have died in the cave. And on the face of it, it seems like there isn't much to unpack in terms of what went wrong here. Martin and his friends were exploring a dangerous cave without the necessary safety equipment, and so, when he slipped on a particularly dangerous section, there was no rope to catch him. But there is another important lesson in this tragic story. Ultimately, there was a reason why Edward Martin and his friends went into this cave without ropes. They were confident they could do it. They, or at least Martin, had been to the cave several times before. It felt familiar to them. And familiarity can sometimes obscure the presence of danger. It's not that prior experience doesn't count for anything, it counts for a lot. Having been to the cave before and having considerable experience with caving in general definitely made the likelihood of Edward Martin having an accident less likely. But the important thing to remember is that it could never have made it impossible. Scaling the 60-foot pass known as Screaming Willies without ropes may be less dangerous if you know what you're doing, but it's still very dangerous. Sadly, Edward Martin encountered the worst possible outcome of that overlooked danger. Having become the site of a horrific death, Sloan's Valley Cave has an aura about it that wasn't there before 2006. Its jagged rock formations and shadowy recesses seem more menacing than perhaps they once did. We can only hope that this unique and relatively unspoiled cave system can remain a place of joy and wonder for the select few who get to visit it, and that no tragedy of such senseless horror will ever strike these passageways again. Deep beneath the mountains, a world of darkness hides adventure and danger. A team of explorers ventures in, but disaster strikes. Trapped and injured, they face a terrifying fight for survival. Can brave rescuers reach them before it's too late? This is the story of the Rescinding Cave Rescue, a real-life adventure where courage is tested in the unforgiving depths of the earth. The Rescinding Cave system was formed through a fascinating natural process involving rain and groundwater that were rich in acid. This acidic water slowly made its way through small openings in the limestone near the peak of the Untersberg Massif. The Untersberg Massif is a massive, flat-topped mountain that reaches an impressive height of 6,400 feet and stands prominently between Germany and Austria. As the acidic rain and groundwater seeped through the tiny cracks and crevices in the limestone, they began to dissolve the rock. Limestone is a type of rock that can be easily dissolved by acid, and over a long period this process created large caverns and deep shafts within the mountain. This is as similar to how a river carves out a canyon over time. What makes the Rescinding Cave system special is how deep it is. The cave starts at the very top of a tall mountain. The water that formed the cave had to travel a long way down before it reached the water table, which is the level where the ground is full of water. Because the water had such a long distance to travel, it made the caverns and shafts in the cave very deep. This makes the Rescinding Cave much deeper than many other caves around the world. There is an old legend about the Untersberg mountain. It says that Frederick I, a holy Roman emperor from the 12th century, is sleeping deep inside the mountain. According to the legend, he will wake up one day to restore Germany to its former glory. But this will only happen under certain conditions. One version of the legend says he will wake up when his beard has grown around a table 3 times. Another version says he will wake up when the ravens stop flying. Because of this legend, people believe it is very important to be quiet inside the mountain. They think that making too much noise might disturb the sleeping emperor, so everyone who goes into the Untersberg mountain is extra careful to be as quiet as possible. They want to make sure they do not wake Frederick I before it is time for him to return. This legend has been told for many generations. It adds a sense of mystery and excitement to the Untersberg mountain. People enjoy imagining the day when the emperor might wake up and bring greatness back to Germany. Whether or not the legend is true, it makes the mountain a special and fascinating place to visit. The Rescinding Cave is known as a pit cave because it goes straight up and down like a deep hole in the ground. This vertical layout makes it very difficult for explorers to move through. To explore the cave caverns, have to go up and down using ropes for most of the journey. This means they have to lower themselves down into the cave and then climb back up when they want to leave. It's like going on a big adventure where you have to rappel down and then climb back up again. This includes an extra challenge and excitement to exploring the Rescinding Cave. In the Rescinding Cave, explorers face a similar challenge to climbers who descend cliffs. They lower themselves down the deep shafts using ropes just like climbers anchor ropes and rappel down cliffs. But the tough part comes when they want to go back up. Traditional rock climbing methods don't work well in deep caves like Rescinding, so instead cavers use a special tool called an ascender. This device helps them climb back up the same rope they use to descend, kind of like inching their way up a ladder. It's a technique sometimes known as jummering or jugging. This special tool makes it possible for cavers to safely return to the surface after exploring the depths of the cave. Dr. George Vanny from Santa Fe, New Mexico, studies caves but hasn't been in Rescinding. Exploring such caves is tough, physically, technically, and mentally. Cavers train for weeks for safety. Going to the bottom isn't done in one trip or by one team. It takes multiple trips and lots of equipment. The team in Krubera Cave in 2012 spent 27 days underground. In Rescinding, you need a boat to cross a blue lake about 930 meters below. Swimming isn't possible due to cold temperatures and high humidity. Deep caves can feel very remote, affecting even fit but inexperienced explorers. Dr. Vanny calls this feeling the rapture of the deep. Johann Westhauser is a man who loves exploring caves, Around noon on 7 June 2014, speleologist and caver Johann Westhauser with his 2 colleagues descended into the Riesending cave in Germany. It's one of the deepest caves in the world. It is known to be technically challenging from the first meters on. Johann and his team went into the cave to study it. They had to crawl through narrow passages and climb down steep rocks. It was very dark and cold inside the cave. Once they reached the first base station, they felt excited and determined to continue. They started descending with the ropes foot by foot into the cold, damp cave with very little light. Despite the challenging conditions, they made it down without any problems, but they were extremely tired from the descent. As they continued, the cave tested them more than they expected, but they kept going. Their hearts were beating fast, and they had to work hard to breathe. Johann started to feel strange as he prepared to descend the second shaft. Even though he had planned this trip for a long time, he realized he was just going through the motions and not really connecting with his colleagues. He focused intensely on the task at hand because he knew how dangerous the exploration was. He understood that any mistake could result in serious injury or even death for himself or his team members. Despite this, he decided to pay more attention to his teammates and appreciate the amazing experience they were sharing together. They began lowering themselves down the next shaft. It seemed pretty easy, and they made it down to base station 2 without much trouble. But one teammate started acting distant, and Johann realized he was in shock from the expedition. The teammate wasn't paying attention and seemed out of it. This could be a big safety problem if he didn't snap out of it. Johann talked to him to boost his spirits, and they decided to keep going. They started descending to the next station, but Johann had a tough time. The cave walls had loose, jagged rocks that could catch their ropes. Johann's rope got stuck, which could cause a rockfall. They kept going down, but the walls got even more dangerous. Rocks were breaking off, and they couldn't see where they were falling from. It was pitch black, except for their small headlamps. They stopped to talk about the falling rocks, but decided they were too far in to turn back. Going back up with the ascender would take too much energy, so they had to keep going down. Johann felt his heart racing and his mind filled with worries, but he managed to refocus. The descent was getting dangerous fast, so they said a prayer before continuing down the ropes. After a while, they reached base station number 3. They still had one more tricky descent to go before reaching the long, straight part of the cave. This part would give them a break from all the descending. They made it down to base station 4, but they were feeling tired by this point. As they moved through the long, straight passage, things seemed to be going according to plan. However, they had been in the cave for over 10 hours, and their focus was starting to fade. Finally, after a couple more hours, they reached base station number 5. They felt exhilarated because reaching this point meant they were close to the undiscovered part of the cave, which was their main goal. But then they realized there was a problem. This part of the cave was dangerous, and there was a higher risk of something bad happening. If they got hurt this deep in the cave, there would be no way to get out, and the cave could become their tomb. As they reached the end of the long straight, they encountered a section of loose rock. They knew this part would be tough, but decided to push forward to reach base station 6. On June 8th, Johann led the way, carefully navigating over the slippery rocks, focused on getting across safely. Around 1:30 a.m., suddenly rocks started falling from the ceiling, and he had to find cover. In the darkness, it was hard to see the falling rocks. Out of nowhere, a large boulder struck Johann on the head, knocking him out. The impact was so strong that it cracked through his plastic helmet. He collapsed to the ground, and the only sounds were the rocks continuing to fall. Johann couldn't protect himself from the rockfall, and his body was lifeless on the ground. At this point, the team had descended 1,000 meters down the cave. One of Johann's teammates witnessed the accident and knew that their exploration had to end immediately. Since there's no radio or cell phone signal inside the cave, one team member stayed with Westhauser to help him while the other person began the long journey back to the entrance. This ascent took around 10 hours and covered a distance of about 6 kilometers. Once the team member reached daylight and was able to make an emergency call, rescue procedures were started immediately. Later that same evening, 3 groups of cave rescuers totaling 11 people went into the cave to find Johann Westhauser and his teammate. They set up a special communication link system that allowed them to send and receive basic messages through the solid rock so they could communicate between the cave entrance and the accident site. More rescue teams from Germany and Austria, along with helicopters from the state and federal police, also joined the effort. On the evening of June 11th, a doctor named Martin Guxu was able to reach Westhauser. He found that Westhauser had a minor brain injury. Another doctor arrived later that night, and together they decided that Westhauser was well enough to be moved. To ensure their safety, the paths inside the cave had to be made more secure. This involved adding more ropes, bolts, and footrests. At its busiest times, there were up to 60 people inside the cave, and almost all of the cave rescue equipment from the Bavarian mountain rescue team called Bergwacht was used. Moving supplies and people through the narrow passages of the cave was tough. They had to do everything by hand because machines couldn't be used. Westhauser's condition stayed stable during the rescue. They made a stretcher that could absorb shock somewhat. In the vertical parts, the rescuers used their own weight to balance the stretcher. On June 19th at 11:44 a.m., they made it out of the cave with the help of a manual winch. Westhauser was then taken to a hospital in Murnau by helicopter. The rescue operation gained widespread attention due to its scale and complexity. It was praised as a significant chapter in the history of alpine rescue efforts. Spanning 11 days, the operation involved the collective efforts of over 700 individuals from various countries including Italy, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Croatia, and more. The multinational team of cave rescuers dedicated their time and expertise to ensure the safe extraction of Johann Westhauser from the depths of Riesending Cave. The consequence of the operation was reflected not only in the number of participants, but also in the resources and coordination required. From meticulously planning the rescue strategy to executing it with precision, every aspect of the operation demanded careful attention. The rescue teams faced numerous challenges, including navigating through narrow passages, transporting supplies, and ensuring the safety of both the rescuers and the victim. In August 2015, the Bavarian Interior Ministry disclosed that the total costs associated with the rescue effort were estimated to be approximately 960,000 euros. This included expenses related to equipment, logistics, and personnel. Additionally, it was noted that Johann Westhauser would be held accountable for a significant portion of the expenses incurred during his rescue. The extensive coverage of the rescue operation served as a testament to the dedication and perseverance of the rescue teams involved. Their unwavering commitment to saving lives in challenging environments exemplified the spirit of solidarity and cooperation among international rescue communities. In late June 2014, the cave's entrance was closed by the police to stop curious people and tourists from getting hurt. Now, you need a special permit to go inside. Only people with valid reason and justified interest are physically fit and have the right skills can get this permit. By 2016, Johann Westhauser had healed from his injuries and started exploring caves again. It wasn't until 2020, 6 years after the rescue, that they cleaned up the cave. They brought up more than 1 ton of garbage left behind from the rescue operation. This included food scraps, plastic packaging, drills, batteries, and medical stuff. Cleaning up was important because garbage and harmful stuff in caves can mess up the water and hurt the bats and other animals that live there. After 11 long days, Johann Westhauser was finally pulled from the depths of the cave. Cheers erupted as he emerged weak but alive. The rescue was a huge success, a testament to human courage and teamwork, but the ordeal left its mark. The rescuers faced incredible dangers, and the emotional toll was heavy. This story is a reminder of the power of human spirit, but also the risks of cave exploration. In 1995, a group of 8 trained divers gathered in Tulum, Mexico for an exciting day of cave diving. They submerged below Tulum into the underwater caverns and traveled through the columns and walls of limestone. By the end of the day, only 5 divers would make it back to the surface alive. The peninsula of Yucatan, located in the southern region of Mexico, is home to over 6,000 cenotes, caves filled with crystal clear water. Because of its beauty and proximity to the Caribbean coast, they've become a major tourist destination, attracting divers from around the world, beginners and experienced alike. The name cenote comes from the Mayan language, meaning water well. These wells were considered vital and sacred to the Mayan people. They were a source of water, a source of life. The Mayans also used them as a portal to speak to the gods. In fact, the skeletal remains of over 120 people were found in one cenote alone, although it is unknown when and how they died. The cenotes connect to an underground cave system, a labyrinth of kilometers-long tunnels. All of these systems, at some point, connect to the sea. This provides the cenotes with a mix of both fresh water from rainfalls and salt water from the ocean. The zone in which fresh and salt water meet is known as a halocline. It creates a murky and dense blur that distorts a diver's view. Diving into the caverns of a cenote is what's known as cave diving. It's classified as an overhead environment dive, meaning there's structures above you. This differs from standard scuba diving or open water diving, in which all you need to do is travel up to surface. In overhead environment dives, you have to either go forward, go backward, or hope that there's a sliver of an air pocket in the case you run into trouble. It requires different types of equipment. This difference is what makes cave diving so dangerous, especially for those not trained in it. Once you begin your dive into the cenotes of Yucatan, you're given a choice. You can stay within the limits of the cavern lines, which are permanent rope guidelines, or you can travel further into the cave system. If you choose to travel beyond the main cavern limits, there is a chance you may not make it back to the surface. The summer of 1995 was a busy one for Maria and her husband Harry. Their dive shop in Cozumel, Mexican divers, had received several calls looking for a guided tour of the Yucatan cenotes. They began planning the logistics of such a tour. Though they were trained open water divers, Maria and Harry had no experience in cave diving. They decided to hire a guide, or dive master, local to the area they would explore, Tulum. They found Juan, an open water instructor. He agreed to take the group to two of his favorite cenotes that he was familiar with. With a tour guide in place and the diving location set, all that was left to do was wait. On August 17th, the group of 8 divers met at Grand Cenote, 5 kilometers north of the town of Tulum. Along with Harry, Maria, and Juan were 3 Dutch, an Italian, and an American woman. Though trained in open water, none were certified for cave diving. The divers strapped on their equipment, jumped into the open mouth of the cave's entrance, and traveled into the clear, blue waters below. The waters were warm and the depths relatively shallow. The group was filled with excitement. They were diving in such a place of beauty. This may have been the most beautiful dive they had been on their entire life. Juan had made this happen. They respected their dive master and placed their trust in him. After spending almost an hour at Grand Cenote, they were ready for their next dive. Just south of Grand Cenote was Cenote Calavera, or the Temple of Doom. The group piled out of their taxis and approached the entrance. In front of them was what looked like a giant skull, a large mouth-like entrance with 2 smaller holes behind. After a resupply and re-equip, they began. One by one, they jumped into the mouth of the skull and down into the water below. Looking back, they saw the sun shine through the openings. A beautiful sight underwater. A ladder, which looked like it had been put there by the Mayans themselves, was the only exit. Juan led the group of 8 through the main section of the cenote. Harry took up the rear. The main section is a large 360-degree area, a radius of around 366 meters. The floor reaches a depth of 14 meters. Many tourists and even experienced divers stay within the cavern limits, but Juan had other plans. As they traversed further into the caverns, they became surrounded by limestone walls and columns dripping from ceiling to floor. This was no open water dive. Juan led them further. They traveled into the Madonna Passage, a tunnel leading to the kilometers-long cave system. The tunnel was past the main caverns, past the guidelines, and past the sign. The sign reading, "Stop, prevent your death, go no further." They were not far into the passage when Harry, moved by panic or premonition, retreated back to the entrance. None of the other 7 noticed he was gone. Juan, despite his responsibility, never looked back. The further they went, the colder it got and the harder it became to see due to dwindling light and halocline interference. All the while, their oxygen supply was continually decreasing. The group continued swimming. They were beginning to panic, frightened by the diminishing oxygen, unsure if they were being led on an adventure or led to their death. After several minutes in the passage, Juan finally looked back at the group and noticed that only 3 divers were left with him. They were low on oxygen. He himself was low on oxygen. Harry waited at the entrance for his wife and the others. It seemed like hours had passed. Should he go back down? Then, a diver resurfaced. It was the Italian, then 2 more, Dutch divers, then a third, Juan. Without explaining, Juan took Harry's partially full tank and traveled back down to the passage. Every second mattered. He swam through the main cavern, through the columns and walls, arriving at the signs. At the entrance, he saw that the seconds no longer mattered. 2 divers out of air, 2 divers dead. There was no more hope for them. He knew there was one left. He traveled further down the passage, and between the walls he found them. The 3rd diver, it was Maria. She was out of air, but still alive. Harry was now outside the entrance, fearing that his wife was gone. He continued looking back at the ladder leading into the skull's mouth. Waiting. The minutes continued to pass by when the splash of a diver surfacing caused Harry to rush to the opening. Juan, the ladder, carrying Maria. She was not breathing. He quickly pulled off her equipment and began CPR. A vehicle arrived to rush Maria to the Red Cross station in Tulum. There was hope, but Juan was seconds too late for Maria, too. She was pronounced dead at the station. Juan retrieved the bodies of the other 2 divers, one of the Dutch tourists and the American woman. The death of 3 divers lay in the hands of an untrained dive master. Juan was never charged with a crime, though many believe his actions should be considered manslaughter. He took a group of divers into dangerous caverns without the proper equipment and without the proper training. The deaths led to pain and anger throughout the Yucatan Peninsula. Dive shop owners and instructors in Yucatan and Cozumel were outraged by the incompetence of Juan. How could he lead this group knowing he wasn't properly trained? They were moved to action. They formed an association to develop a list of safety policies and procedures for diving in the cenotes. Those policies have influenced the training and practices of instructors and shops throughout the area. This story is unfortunately not unique. So many divers have suffered the same fate underwater, especially in the cenotes of Yucatan, where divers, many untrained and inexperienced, continue to lose their lives to this day. The number one cause of death for cave diving is suffocation, which amounts to 2 things: improper gear and improper training. Without the right training, you can get lost and find yourself surrounded by the unknown walls and caverns underwater, becoming disoriented and never making it to the surface again. So next time you find yourself underwater, looking down a dark tunnel and at a sign that reads, "Stop, prevent your death."
El Capitan in Yosemite is one of the most famous landmarks in one of the world's most famous national parks. Its fame only grew after Alex Honnold climbed it in the Oscar-winning documentary Free Solo. But of course, while all of us admire El Capitan's beauty and draw inspiration from athletes like Honnold, most of us probably also have a darker curiosity lingering in the backs of our minds. What if you fall off? How often does that happen? And just how catastrophic is the fallout from a disaster like that? It's an idea so primally horrifying as to be hard to wrap your mind around. But in 2018, the very same year that Free Solo came out, 2 experienced climbers fell while climbing El Capitan. This disaster did more than claim 2 lives and traumatize the entire valley. It also spread awareness to a concerning trend that, according to some, has been making rock climbing more dangerous in recent years. Jason Wells and Tim Klein were best friends. They met each other while both were attending college in San Diego. They had been rock climbing together ever since. A friend of Tim Klein's later told reporters that Tim said Jason was the best partner he ever climbed with. Both men are said to have been highly knowledgeable and skilled climbers. On June 2nd, 2018, Klein and Wells were in Yosemite Valley preparing to ascend the infamous El Capitan. Their plan was to follow a route up the monolith known as Free Blast. Free Blast was described by Alex Honnold back in 2016 as being, quote, like a 10-pitch slab. He also described major sections of the 3,000-foot monolith as being, quote, basically like walking on a sheet of glass. As you can probably tell just by looking at it, El Capitan is not for beginners, and it's both a physically and mentally demanding climb, even for experts. Jason Wells and Tim Klein had ascended El Capitan together numerous times before, so they had a leg up on most. However, Klein and Wells weren't just planning to ascend El Capitan at a leisurely pace. The pair were poised to speed climb the monolith. Jason Wells held the world record for fastest ascent of the Naked Edge in Colorado. It stands to reason that he and his number 1 climbing partner might have been hoping to make a similar record on El Capitan, although their June ascent may have just been for training purposes. Klein and Wells awoke at the crack of dawn on Saturday, June 2nd, 2018. Yosemite Valley at sunrise is one of the most picturesque sights in the world, having graced various default wallpapers on Apple devices for years. That summer morning was warm, sunny, and clear, but the scenic atmosphere was tinged with nervous excitement. Decked out in climbing attire with all their gear strapped to their backs, Jason Wells and Tim Klein walked along the valley floor towards the foot of El Capitan, surrounded by the sleepy sounds of the early morning forest. By 6 a.m., the pair reached the starting point. It was already 80 degrees Fahrenheit and would reach almost 100 by the middle of the day. In order to speed climb El Capitan, the plan was to engage in a technique known as simul climbing. Simul climbing is an advanced technique that allows 2 climbers to ascend at the same time while being tied to the same rope. One reason this is considered an advanced technique is because it makes the risks associated with slipping and falling much,
much greater. There is no fixed anchor to catch the force of the fall. If one climber slips and the other one isn't braced for it, both can easily come tumbling down. Wells and Klein were using this technique so they could climb faster, but they were also raising the stakes if either one of them were to lose their footing along the way. By around 8 a.m., Jason Wells and Tim Klein had ascended roughly 1,000 feet up the free blast route of El Capitan. They were on the Salate Wall, a famously smooth vertical pitch with massive cracks running down it. No one alive today knows for certain what happened next. A climber named Jordan Cannon, who is likely the last person to have seen Jason Wells and Tim Klein alive, told the Seattle Times he saw the pair approaching a section of the El Cap ascent called Mammoth Terraces. Cannon was himself climbing El Cap that day as part of a separate excursion. He was about 200 feet below Klein and Wells at that particular time. It was only minutes after this that witnesses on the valley floor reported hearing a scream echo through the morning air. Jordan Cannon heard the scream too, from directly above his spot on the wall. At that moment, Cannon was perched underneath an outcrop and could not see above him. He then heard what he thought was the sound of a haul bag coming loose. But a second later, out from underneath the outcrop, Cannon saw something fly by. And it wasn't a haul bag. It was the flipping, crashing, contorting body of Jason Wells. Naturally, this scared the hell out of Cannon, but being an experienced climber himself, he instinctively assumed that Wells would soon be caught by the rope he was attached to. That was until he heard another yell from up above. A split second later, the body of Tim Klein flew by Cannon's line of sight, in total freefall. In shock, Jordan Cannon could see that both men were tied together by a blue rope which was now attached to nothing. The rope got caught on a rock at one point during the fall, but rather than stop the fall, the rope split in half. Cannon vividly recalls watching the white core strands of the rope explode, spraying out in all directions. One can only imagine how deeply seared in Cannon's mind this image will forever be. The distance from where Jason Wells and Tim Klein slipped all the way to the bottom of El Capitan is estimated to have been roughly the height of the Empire State Building. Given there was some crashing and colliding along the way, the fall probably took about 10 seconds. The chances of surviving a fall like this are basically zero. Local emergency crews rushed to the scene, but unfortunately all that could truly be done was collect the bodies of Jason Wells and Tim Klein. Yosemite Search and Rescue immediately launched an investigation to try and determine what caused this horrifying, fatal accident. Meanwhile, Jordan Cannon, who was still suspended on the side of El Capitan, decided to do some investigating of his own, given that he was the closest person on Earth to the scene of the accident. Cannon continued to ascend the monolith. He soon reached the area where Wells and Klein had fallen from. He found rope abrasions, fresh scrapes made along the rock wall. But beyond this, he couldn't find any interesting evidence. There was nothing Cannon saw that to him suggested a gear malfunction of some kind. Later on, the founder and president of the Yosemite Climbing Association, Ken Yeager, spoke to the Seattle Times about the accident and speculated on what, in his expert opinion, probably happened. Yeager believes the duo made an error of overconfidence. He described their decision not to place protections or tie into an anchor as a violation of a cardinal rule. He also criticized the general trend of climbing enthusiasts becoming increasingly interested in speedy, exhilarating climbing. Not only is speed climbing more dangerous, but in Yeager's opinion, it isn't necessary. Climbing a natural wonder like El Capitan is exciting enough at any speed. Looking at this 3,000-foot rock wall and imagining the task of ascending it, it is hard to disagree with Ken Yeager. To most people, the idea of not only climbing this thing, but trying to do it as fast as possible to increase the stakes and the thrill of it seems, frankly, nuts. But then again, Jason Wells and Tim Klein were not most people. They were some of the most experienced and competent climbers out there. and they were especially familiar with the routes in Yosemite. The Yosemite Climbing Association's president's comments about a growing trend are concerning. It gives the impression that speed climbing attempts like this are on the rise, and that the future may see more accidents, not less. Accidents on huge monoliths like El Capitan are terrifying, not because of how likely they are, but because of how likely they are to be fatal when they do happen. Given the fact that falling from thousands of feet above a valley floor is basically guaranteed to kill you, all that can be said is one hopes future climbers will be less inclined to raise the stakes for the sake of thrill-seeking or record-breaking, or if they do so with extreme conservative caution. Sterkfontein is one of the most important areas for paleontology and anthropology research. Otherwise known as Strong Spring, this remote African cave system is a treasure trove of ancient humans and our distant ancestors. But one brave explorer fell prey to Sterkfontein's death trap: underwater caves that have been killing humans for millennia. Today, we're covering the race against time to rescue a Sterkfontein cave diver that turned into a marathon that shocked the caving world back in the 80s. Sterkfontein, otherwise known as Strong Spring, is a limestone cave system at the World Heritage Site known as the Cradle of Humankind. The Cradle of Humankind is located 31 miles north of Johannesburg, which is the 26th largest city in the world and the capital of the wealthiest province in South Africa. The Cradle of Humankind was created to study the area and to protect the land. It's a haven for paleontologists and archaeologists. Paleontologists study fossils to uncover how animals lived in different periods of time, and archaeologists study the ancient cultures of our ancestors. Researchers in the region are most interested in researching hominins, or the branch of evolution that humans came from. Research at Cradle of Humankind is mostly done in two caves, the Marapeng and Sterkfontein. The first human ape fossils found at the Cradle of Humankind were discovered in the Sterkfontein caves in 1935 by Robert Broom, a medical doctor and paleontologist who made a number of valuable discoveries. In the Marapeng cave, 92 different hominid species have been discovered. A single chamber in Sterkfontein, the Dinaledi chamber, houses over 1,500 fossils from the Homo naledi species of humans. No other site in Africa has as many fossils from any one species. In total, over 90,000 fossils have been unearthed there, and roughly 40% of the world's ancestral fossils have been found exclusively at Cradle of Humankind. Out of the two caves, Marapeng is open to visitors with a museum that showcases the skeletal fossils and the ancient tools that were used by our ancestors. The museum also has a tour of Marapeng that extends into Sterkfontein, and the tour also lets visitors see active excavations. The Sterkfontein, or Strong Spring Caves, are made of dolomitic limestone dating back over 20 million years. The dolomite portion of the cave dates back 2.58 billion years when the region was at the bottom of a sea, but the modern caves began forming when weak acids and rainwater were absorbed by the porous limestone, which eventually carved out tunnels and chambers. Some of the spots where rainfall collected on the surface became massive potholes, and animal bones built up at the bottom of these vertical shafts after they unknowingly fell in or died and were thrown in over the years. Different portions of the cave have different entrances, including a massive hole leading to the big cave portions, while the Windgat portion has a narrow 40 feet deep chimney hole for its entrance. The Windgat portion of Sterkfontein has some of the most impressive speleothems in the caves, with massive stalagmites, huge flowstone, curvy curtains, and crystallized ferns. Wildlife species also inhabit the cave, including the petiolata wasps that swarm on the cave ceilings and create colonies much like ants with special social roles. The caves at Sterkfontein were first used as limestone mines almost half a century before Robert Broom uncovered the first ape fossils at the Cradle of Humankind. The limestone was converted to lime, which was used to process gold. Dynamite blasts from the miners eventually revealed the entrance to the cave system. In 1890, the first non-human fossils were discovered in the caves. World War II put a halt to the excavation at Sterkfontein, but Dr. Broom came back later to find Mrs. Pless, a nearly intact skull from the species Australopithecus africanus, which was only recently redacted when new research uncovered the skull was from a male. While a number of important discoveries have been made at Sterkfontein, the cave has also been the site of international disasters. In 1984, the Sterkfontein caves were world-renowned, but they weren't under as much control as they are now. It would be another 15 years before the caves got protected status under the new governing body of the Cradle of Humankind. In recent years, South Africa has also enacted laws to preserve its caves, making it illegal to harm or take portions of caves without permission. That year, in 1984, 29-year-old Peter Verhulst explored the cave with a group of two his friends. They were going cave diving in the Cradle of Humankind. In cave diving, there's one important rule: never let go of the guideline. Some guidelines are attached to the rock itself to provide a permanent safety measure for anyone diving in the cave. The only reasonable time anyone would let go of these lines would be during missions to lay new guidelines in the first place. This task can't be done by novice or even advanced divers. Permanent guidelines in underwater caves should only be set by experts in the field with proper equipment. More commonly, divers will use distance lines, which can be held in the hand and clipped onto scuba gear for added safety. The other end can be attached to a surface marker buoy for divers traveling roughly 160 feet, while exploration reels used for official or expert survey work can be bulky and hold over 2,000 feet of line. Cave divers usually need multiple reels that need to be attached to checkpoints. The guidelines themselves are made of white nylon, which provides the best visibility in low light and enough strength and buoyancy for most situations. Some deep cave dives require divers to map out the placement of various temporary guidelines. Teams will make knots or use line markers to mark different distances along the route. Cave reels use adjustable drag so that the line can be recovered or laid down at swimming speed. Divers of any experience level should carry safety spools which can be used in an emergency, like if the line breaks. Cave divers have to keep tension on their own guidelines at all times to avoid snagging the line on sharp rocks or wrapping the line around other divers. Divers laying permanent lines have to be aware of the space to ensure the line is visible at all times. Sometimes, inexperienced divers will fit through a narrow hole and lay down guiding line through the hole, but if they're skinny or smaller in stature, they might not realize that other people can't follow the line. They also might not realize how the passage travels in the opposite direction. If the hole is too narrow to pass through for most people, or if the return trip is too dangerous, these amateur lines become line traps, and they can easily kill. On September 29, 1984, Peter Verhulst followed behind his two friends. He wasn't as experienced as his friends, so he should have been in the middle where the two could watch him, but they kept him in the back, trailing behind. Unfortunately, Peter ignored the safety rules for cave divers. He only brought a single light and one scuba tank or self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, and he only brought one light source. It's always smart to carry at least one smaller emergency tank, if not a full-sized backup. Small emergency tanks can be placed on the arm, back, side, or the stomach of divers. These units are separated from the main tank, and divers have to activate the emergency tanks so that they don't drain during normal use. Of course, this was the 80s when equipment wasn't as good, and the dangers of caving weren't broadcast to the whole world online. Peter and his friends were diving in the ancient recesses of the Sterkfontein caves when Peter let go of the guideline. Without a guideline of his own, he took off to explore a side passage. His friends waited. Unable to speak underwater, they eventually signaled in silence. One by one, they followed in his direction. Darkness surrounded them with only algae-covered rock in all directions. After a few heart-pounding minutes, they found Peter and took him back to the guideline. A few minutes later, and Peter's adventurous side took over once more. He veered off from the guideline and his fins kicked silt up as he swam into a dark tunnel. His friends took chase and grabbed him, nearly pulling him back to the path and back to the tenuous safety of the bright white nylon rope. They kept advancing through the flooded ventricles of the Cradle of Humankind. Peter felt more confident after being found twice, and, without signaling to his friends, he swam off a third time into the unknown. This time, his friends kept swimming. Eventually, they paused and turned around to find Peter had vanished. After the distance they had traveled, there were many passages he could have gone through, so they tried waiting. They kept waiting, and after uncomfortable minutes greeted only by the sounds from their own eerie breathing and their ever-increasing heart rate pounding in their ears. After they waited for what felt like eternity in the flooded tubes below an African fossil field, the two other divers grabbed their safety spools and backtracked. The two divers couldn't move quickly because their safety guidelines had to be accounted for. They couldn't let out too much at once, they couldn't take sharp turns, and they had to be wary of each other to avoid getting tangled. Eventually, they got warning signs that their oxygen was low. The two friends had no choice but to head back to the surface.
After a frantic escape from the strong spring, they immediately called for rescue teams. Heroic rescuers made the dive. Nothing. They ventured deeper with more guidelines to explore the side routes. No sign of Peter. He had simply disappeared. Eventually, hope ran out for finding their friend alive, but they kept trying and switched the focus to a recovery effort. After 6 weeks of searching, the bulk of the rescue team packed up and went home. A few divers weren't deterred by the main operation ending. They kept diving. Eventually, they found a hole leading out of the main cave, which lead out of the sump and onto walkable pathway. They found footprints in the muddy waters of this deep, dark crevice. In an island in the distance, they found Peter crumpled on the ground, dead. Peter Verhulsel joined the thousands of ancient humans who also died in the cave. An autopsy revealed he had survived 3 weeks in perpetual darkness. It wasn't oxygen or exposure that got him, but rather he died of starvation while desperately awaiting rescue. Nearby, they found a message in the sand Peter had scrawled addressed to his wife and his mother, where he wrote how much he loved them. In another sad twist to the story, the Cradle of Humankind closed the underground lake portion of the cave, so no surveyors can explore the depths of Sterkfontein, and the full depth of the cave, one of humanity's most important archaeological sites, remains unknown. Out of all of the possible caves, underwater caves like those at Sterkfontein are by far the most deadly. While rocks can collapse or people can get lost, there are way more dangers with diving, and it's nearly impossible to survive a mistake.
The daring climber Sudarshan Gautam once said, "Disability is not inability." At a young age, Gautam had both arms amputated after a devastating accident, but that didn't stop him from achieving his dreams. Back in May of 2013, he returned to his birthplace of Nepal to climb the tallest mountain in the world, Mount Everest. The challenge left him stranded on the mountainside tens of thousands of feet above the ground. That's when legendary rescuer Simone Moro and his team sprang into action to perform a world record-breaking rescue. This is the story of how Gautam, a man with no arms, achieved his dream, and how rescuers pulled off the impossible to save him from the brink of death. The first hero of the story, Sudarshan Gautam, was born in Nepal. Nepal is an ancient and storied country located to the north of India. The oldest evidence of human civilization in Nepal shows our ancestors were living there over 30,000 years ago. The creator of Buddhism, Gautama Buddha, was born in Nepal back in roughly the 5th century. Nepal is also one of the most beautiful places in the world, and it's the crown jewel of mountaineering. 8 of the world's tallest mountains are found there. Gautam was born in the Rameklap district on the eastern edge of Nepal, but a few years later his family moved to Kathmandu. Kathmandu is the capital of Nepal and the largest city in the country. Kathmandu is located in a valley alongside a number of tall mountains that extend high into the clouds. The elevation of Kathmandu is already impressive, with the average person standing at roughly 4,600 feet above sea level. Along with its impressive surroundings, Kathmandu is one of the oldest cities in the world, stemming back to the 2nd century. Nepal's rich cultural heritage and vibrant landscapes inspired young Gautam as he gazed up at the majestic and indomitable peaks of the Himalayas. A gray cloud soon darkened Sudarshan's horizons, but he would weather the storm and come out stronger than ever before. When he was roughly 13, Gautam was flying a kite when a sudden gust of wind sent the toy flying too close to live power cables. Gautam and his family might have thought that he was safe since his kite string was shorter than the height of the power cables, but the kite didn't even have to make contact with the power line to change Gautam's life forever. Even step-down power lines have enough voltage to generate their own electrical field that extend beyond the power lines themselves. If anything gets within that electrical field, the power lines can discharge powerful jolts of electricity through the air and into the target. The average power line easily contains enough amps to kill a full-grown adult. The shock didn't fry his heart, but he had both hands on the kite string, and the doctors had to amputate both arms to save Sudarshan's life. Undeterred, Sudarshan learned to use his feet in place of his hands. Eventually, he could eat, do household chores, and even shave using his feet. Once he learned how to write with his feet, Gautam used his power of perseverance and his sharp mind to attain an undergrad degree in computer science. he used a normal, unmodified computer, typing on a keyboard with his toes and controlling a mouse with his feet. Afterward, he obtained his master's degree in commerce. Going viral online wasn't even a concept back in 1999 when he demonstrated his ability to drive a car without hands. But thousands attended his demonstration, and news outlets all over Asia and the rest of the world reported on his achievement. Afterward, Gautam moved to Canada, where he fostered a family and continued to embody his own motto by taking on a hobby that most people could never dream of: mountain climbing. Most climbers might opt for easy hikes or even indoor climbing to learn the ropes, but indoor facilities are usually designed for both leg and hand work, and since Gautam relied on his feet, he needed to practice elsewhere. New climbers might choose beginner mountains and temperate climates with peaks ranging from 10 to 15,000 feet. But Gautam chose to challenge himself. He got his start climbing Mounts Yala and Ramdung, two mountains near his homeland that have frigid cold snow, low oxygen, sheer rock, and high altitudes. Mount Yala is roughly an 18,000-foot ascent, while Ramdung is approximately 19,400 feet tall. After these two successful climbs, Gautam felt ready to achieve his lifelong goal. He set his eyes on the world's tallest peak. Gautam set out to climb Everest just like anyone else, training, gathering resources, acclimating to the environment, mentally preparing, and researching the route. However, he had a choice to make. He could try an easier route using prosthetics, or he could rely solely on his own body and his climbing gear. He never let his disability stop him before, so just like he drove cars, he donned his cold weather gear and began his journey with just his legs to carry him. The early portions of the climb were easy. He'd already climbed mountains roughly 2/3 the height of Everest. He made progress through the various camps designed to give climbers places to rest and warm up. The only major difference so far was the time it took him to climb. Gautam had to take each step carefully since he couldn't rely on his hands to catch him if he slipped. One step at a time, Gautam slowly rose up the tallest mountain in the world. Before long, on that fateful day on May 20th, 2013, Sudarshan Gautam became the first person in history to climb to the summit of Mount Everest without arms and without the use of prosthetics. He took in the view he had only dreamed of. He truly proved that he was not defined by his disability. Gautam succeeded where thousands of others had failed. Before long, Gautam began his descent. But that's where trouble started brewing. The extra time Gautam spent climbing was coming back to bite him. Almost all of the resources on climbing Everest are based on the average climber. Gautam was exceptional, but few guides will account for an extended trip both up and down the mountain. Even oxygen supplies will assume a particular time window. The cumulative effects of Everest's harsh climate were starting to take their toll. Gautam had to try harder than nearly anyone else to make his ascent, and the climb left him exhausted. The thin air made him weaker and unable to recover. At roughly 25,000 feet, just barely into his descent, the first person to summit Everest without arms was stranded. The second batch of heroes in this story was led by Italian mountaineer and alpinist Simone Moro. Moro learned his love of climbing from his father, who was also a professional climber. Together with his father, Moro started climbing at the age of 13. He practiced on Mount Presolana, an intimidating mountain in the Bergamasque Alps with its highest peak standing 8,271 feet above sea level. Since then, Simone Moro has gone on to achieve world-first winter ascents of Makalu, the 5th tallest mountain in the world, 3 more world-first winter ascents, a world record for the highest flight altitude in a turbine rotorcraft in the E1A category with his 21,990-foot ascent in 2015, and he's climbed Everest 4 times. Moro was also involved in what was called the first ever fight on Mount Everest. During one of his climbs on the world's tallest mountain, the local Nepalese Sherpas, or mountain guides, were fixing ropes and anchor points along one of the routes on Everest. The Sherpas radioed to Moro and his team, asking them to stay away from their lines because they were belaying, which made the work even more dangerous. Belaying involves 2 or more climbers, with someone at the bottom to hold tension on the rope to keep the climber safe. But the people holding the rope have to release the slack to allow the climbers to ascend. Once the Sherpas start climbing, they're at the mercy of their own highest anchor point. One wrong move could lead to catastrophe. Moro's team agreed and stayed out of their way until they absolutely had to cross the same line the Sherpas were using to reach their own camp. Supposedly, ice fell on the Sherpas, bruising one of their faces. The Sherpas demanded that Moro's team return to the camp below the construction. Tensions flared. The Italians begrudgingly offered to help them finish their work, and both sides started to get aggressive. Once Moro's team descended to Camp 2, the world-renowned climbers were mobbed by roughly 100 Sherpas, who allegedly threw rocks at them. Normally, rescue teams are established by local governments. That means they're paid in taxpayer dollars. It didn't sit well with Moro to be on the government payroll to rescue people while enjoying his hobby. The spirit of mountaineering and climbing is one of freedom. There aren't standard goals like regular sports. It's all about exploring yourself and the world around you. Moro was tired of being an employee, and after he was involved in the first fight on Everest, he realized he needed a change of pace. He decided to create his own autonomous team of rescuers to gain independence from the Nepalese Sherpas and the other barriers that held him back. But there was a huge problem. How would his team be able to outperform official teams outfitted with gear from the government? The answer was simple. Moro just bought a helicopter and had it shipped to Nepal. Moro's team consisted of fellow Italians Armin Senoner and Maurizio Follini. Senoner is a multiple-time free-skiing champion and world record speed rider. Free-skiing is a sport where daredevils ski down natural terrain, while speed riding is a sport that combines skiing with paragliding, giving skiers specialized wings designed to help them zip down mountainsides. Because of the natural backcountry ski routes involved with free skiing, the sport has a tendency to spark avalanches, making it one of the most dangerous winter sports. In Europe, roughly 80% of the people who die by avalanche are free skiers or free snowboarders. Enrico Cerea was the team's pilot prior to this daring rescue operation, but he was replaced by Maurizio Follini for this mission. Over the course of his career, Follini has racked up over 9,000 hours of flight time, over double that of the average military pilot. Follini is also a mountaineer and a longtime rescuer. As soon as the call to rescue Gautam came through, Moro and his team scrambled into action. They got the details on where Gautam was stranded, and they immediately knew that this ordeal would be nearly impossible. Normally, people stranded near the summit will be brought to lower elevations by a team of rescue climbers. Helicopters will drop the rescuers as close as they can, but they usually only go up 2/3 of the mountain. Since Gautam was without arms, the team had to take a risk and fly to him. In order to rescue him, they'd have to fly beyond their helicopter's limits. Without hesitation, Moro, Follini, and Senoner got to work dismantling some of the seats and removing all of the doors on the helicopter. Then they loaded only the minimum amount of fuel required for the trip to reduce the vehicle's weight. These strategies would put less strain on the helicopter's mechanics, hopefully allowing them to fly higher than the craft was meant to reach. But it was a gamble. No one was sure if they could pull off the rescue, but they didn't even consider bailing on Gautam. They loaded the necessary ropes and gear and took off into the clouds. The team left from their base camp, which was already at over 9,000 feet above sea level, and they quickly climbed to an altitude of 20,000 feet. Rapid ascents at such high altitude can cause serious side effects on the human body. Atmospheric pressure drops as you climb higher, and rapid changes in pressure can cause acute mountain sickness or sudden altitude sickness, which causes dizziness, nausea, and headaches. All things that could easily compromise the mission and send the team plummeting to their deaths. In rare instances, sudden jumps in elevation can cause a high-altitude cerebral edema, where blood capillaries burst when the brain begins to swell with fluid, leading to coma or death. On the cold, unforgiving surface of Everest, Gautam was already suffering from the more prolonged effects of the early stages of altitude sickness. Gautam didn't sail to the top in mere minutes to cause rapid altitude sickness, but rather, his body was starting to shut down from lack of oxygen. Studies showed that the Sherpas evolved to have changes in their DNA, allowing them to be more efficient with using oxygen. But even though Gautam was from Nepal, his body wasn't prepped for the extreme conditions of Everest. The air gets thinner as you climb higher. Near the peak of Everest, the air contains roughly 1/3 of the oxygen that you'd inhale at sea level. But not all of this oxygen is able to be absorbed by the body. Taking into account other molecules in the air, mucus in the nose and throat, and strain on the body, the effective oxygen levels can be as low as 8.7% at the elevation where Gautam was stranded. All rescues are on a fast clock, but this one was on a different level. If, by some miracle, the rescue team reached Gautam, Moro would have only roughly 30 seconds to secure him to the rescue line. As they climbed higher, the mechanical strain on their helicopter was burning through fuel fast. And because they only loaded the minimum amount of fuel needed for the mission, Fellini knew that if he stayed airborne any longer than 30 seconds, they'd be headed for a crash landing. Adding even more tension to the mission, the team had to use a long line technique to rescue Gautam. Some rescues can be done with just a team of climbers, but it all depends on where people get stuck. Some parts of the mountain are too risky to try to climb with an injured or incapacitated person. It's also unsafe for the helicopter to get too close to the mountain. The maneuver could risk colliding the craft into a rock, causing a fiery crash, or the downward wind current of the helicopter could spark an avalanche. In Gautam's rescue, and in situations where climbers aren't enough, helicopters have to use a very long rope to stay far enough away from the mountain in order to safely rescue the trapped climber. This technique is also called the Helicopter Flight Rescue System, or sometimes the Helicopter External Transport System. But this technique is risky, especially for Gautam, who had the misfortune of having a double amputation. None of the rescuers had encountered someone as exceptional as Gautam, so they had to double down on the securing methods that they thought would work. The team's helicopter groaned as frost built up around the metal. The helicopter managed to get into position, and Moro only had seconds to act. Moro quickly got Gautam into the rescue harness and secured it to the main load line, a high-visibility rope with a 9/16" braid that could withstand up to 25,500 pounds of force. The whole rope was connected to the craft via a Y lanyard that connected at multiple points, including a belly band or a strap that goes through the middle of the plane and around the underside for added security. Moro sent the radio signal to Fellini, and the helicopter took off, lifting Gautam off the cliffside and into the air. For the people being saved, long-line rescue operations are almost as terrifying as being stranded on the mountain because they're not loaded into the helicopter. Gautam had to dangle thousands of feet above the ground while the helicopter reached the designated drop-off point. Gautam had only a few minutes of terror suspended by a helicopter that was very near its breaking point before he was brought back to safety. During the Everest fight, the Sherpas thought the Italian rescuers were selfish. But when it came time to save Gautam's life, they only cared about the task at hand. In an interview with Planet Mountain, Moro talks about how they didn't even look at their altimeter to see how high they were. They weren't even thinking about breaking a record. They were fully focused on saving another climber's life. In that same interview, Fellini, the team's pilot, said, "The aim wasn't to set a record, but to save someone's life." Gautam wasn't the only one to break a world record that day. After the Sherpas and other teams analyzed the rescue, they congratulated Moro and his team for breaking the world record for the highest altitude long-line mountain climbing rescue in history. Moro and his team were in disbelief. They didn't just break the record, they smashed it. The previous record was set at an altitude of 6,900 feet, but their official record was set at 23,000 feet. 23,000 feet is the maximum height value listed on the Eurocopter product page for the team's AS-350B3 Plus helicopter. However, the team's equipment showed that they reached heights of over 25,000 feet, which means the whole mission could have come crashing down at any point. Simone Moro, Maurizio Follini, and Armin Senoner didn't get much fanfare, but Moro kept trying to grow his team. Eventually, he wanted a second helicopter and a second team of specialists who could even climb mountains in harsh weather that made helicopter rescues impossible. The team went back to base and carried on performing rescue operations nearly every day for the rest of 2013. All three rescuers continue to remain active in the climbing world. Sudarshan Gautam didn't dwell on his rescue. Nothing could squash the joy he felt in accomplishing his lifelong dream of climbing to the top of Mount Everest. A year after achieving his childhood dream, Sudarshan Gautam was inducted into the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame. Gautam went on to become an actor in the film Himatwale, or A Brave Person. His work helped advocate for disability reform in Nepal. And on top of all his other successes, Gautam now owns multiple businesses, including restaurants. So if you're ever in the area, check out his stores and pay your respects to one of climbing's most legendary figures and the brave rescuers who made this story possible. The city of Bengsi in China is the site of the worst mining disaster in human history. It all started with Bengsihu Colliery, a coal mine that was taken from China in the early 1900s. Bengsihu was notoriously brutal for the unfortunate miners stuck there, and the disaster may have been covered up for years. Today, we're braving the depths to explore the worst mining accident of all time and the strange history surrounding it. The city of Bengsi has long been a mining and industrial town with yields of 13 million tons of steel, 14 million tons of raw iron, 1 million tons of coal, and an unspecified amount of radioactive uranium. The city dates back to the ancient periods of human history, and Bengsi is also home to two distinct ethno-religious groups in China, the Hui and the Manchu. The Hui people are Chinese-speaking Muslims who descended from Middle Eastern immigrants that ventured to China on silk trade routes during the Han Dynasty. The Manchu are the fourth largest ethnic group in China, and they're also part of the Tungusic peoples who are native to Siberia. Bengsi became a hotbed of conflict during the Second Sino-Japanese War between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan, which was one of the central battlegrounds of the Pacific theater of World War II. Japan caught China off guard. While the country has become a global superpower with one of the most aggressive armies in the world today, back then, China had no mechanized divisions and almost no military force. Japan quickly began taking ground on the Chinese mainland. Local Chinese populations organized resistance forces in occupied territory, but the Japanese forces were able to keep Bengsi for close to a decade. The Japanese established a puppet state dubbed Manchukuo after their invasion of Manchuria on September 18, 1931. Since Manchukuo was a constitutional monarchy under the control of Japan, the Hui and Manchu people had limited political sway and even less help from the international community since their temporary country wasn't officially recognized by most nations. Bengsi had only recently been established as a mining town by the time the Japanese arrived on the shores of the Liaoning province. The first mines in the city were founded in 1905. One of these first mines in Bengsi was dubbed the Bengsihu Colliery. The mine was also sometimes called the Honhaiko Colliery, and despite growing tensions and the eventual all-out war between the two countries, it was actually joint-owned and operated by Japan and China in its early days. Although the mine was located in East Asia, the company took the name Colliery, which is the British term for coal mines. Back then, the Bengsihu Colliery produced only iron and coal, and conditions were deplorable even for an industry known as the most dangerous job on the planet. Miners have faced centuries of workplace issues, chronic health problems, dangerous on-site conditions, low pay, and long hours. But once Japan took over the plant, things got much worse. The local Chinese populations were forced to work the mines while the exports were shipped back to mainland Japan. Prisoners of war were also sent to the Bengsihu Colliery as a form of punishment. Workers at Bengsihu were starved and they weren't allowed new clothes, so they were eventually wearing rags which exposed their skin to the harsh chemicals and fine dust of the mines. The Japanese administration at Honhaiko did provide shoes to new miners, but they were such poor quality that they disintegrated after only a week in the mines. When workers tried to protest, they would be forced into their mine shafts by overseers who would use the handle of pickaxes to shove them down. Disease ran rampant through the mines. Salmonella typhi bacteria caused typhoid fever, which caused skin rashes, headaches, abdominal pains, vomiting, and fevers as high as 104.9 degrees. This was the same illness that took out 85% of the Native American population at James River. Cholera also spread due to the lack of sanitation, which caused even worse dehydration and muscle cramps that made it impossible for afflicted people to swing their pickaxes. Even to this day, cholera accounts for almost 130,000 deaths per year. The Honheko coal mine had only one small hospital that was unequipped to handle the huge number of workers and the large-scale disease outbreak. Sick miners were given less food, which further added to their likely death sentence. When sick laborers were brought to the hospital, they would place their clothes in a heap behind the building, because if they died, the clothes could be reused. The bodies of the dead wouldn't be buried during the winters, and in the spring, workers would escort carts of bodies to be thrown in the South Tiananmen mass grave. Miners were stuck working 12-hour shifts, and they couldn't escape since the area was locked, and the perimeter was guarded by an electric fence. Because the Japanese overseers didn't care about the workers of the mine, they let the air quality drop. Poor circulation allowed fine particles of coal dust to build up in the air. Coal's main use is its ability to be burned for fuel, so the very air itself became flammable. The buildup of coal dust was worsened by the presence of fire damp, which is a term for any type of flammable gas found in mines. Fire damp often comes in the form of methane gas, which is released from the coal bed, and it's released in higher quantities from bituminous or black coal, which is mixed with tar. The buildup of fire damp and coal dust created a recipe for disaster. On April 26, 1942, a coal dust explosion ripped through the Bengsihu colliery. Coal fuel explosions are a specific type of the more general fuel-air explosion. To get a grasp of how deadly these disasters can be, this type of explosion is even used in thermobaric weapons of mass destruction, and man-made fuel-air explosions are the second most powerful weapons, right behind nuclear warheads. The blast radiated throughout the city of Bengsi. Families rushed to the gates of the colliery only to be denied entry by the Japanese military occupants. Families waited in horror for 10 days while the administration performed cleanup duties, which mostly involved removing dead bodies from the mine shaft. After the blast, Japanese newspapers downplayed the event by reporting only 34 people had died. It turns out this number was close to one statistic from the blast, the number of Japanese deaths. It was later revealed that 31 Japanese people died in the Bengsihu colliery explosion, but a shocking total of 1,518 Chinese miners also died in the incident. While this is the largest death toll of any mine incident by far, that was only 34% of the total workers employed in the mine that day, which further shows just how cramped and inhumane the conditions really were there. The mine stayed under Japanese control until 1945. After World War II ended, the Soviet Union ran an investigation on the Bengsihu colliery, where they found even more shocking details about the mining disaster. A small percentage of the deaths were caused by the initial blast. Most of the deaths at Bengsihu were suffered after the initial explosion. Instead of rescuing the remaining miners, the Japanese guards sealed off the pit head exit, and they also closed the ventilation shafts. The administration claimed this was done to prevent the fire from spreading, but the mine hadn't been fully evacuated, which trapped the miners below ground, where they suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning and suffocated to death. The miners were buried in a mass grave alongside those that died from sickness. Many of the miners couldn't be identified because they had been burned too badly. The Soviet researchers found that the incident could have been prevented if the Bengsihu colliery used large fans to ventilate the mine. The overseers could have performed better checks on the level of methane in the air and drilled drainage holes to help exhaust the fumes. Alternatively, they could have used water sprays to lower the temperature of the air and prevent toxins from taking on a gaseous state. Workers could have also added limestone slabs in sections of the mine to absorb the shock wave and the flames from the explosion to prevent it from reaching to further stages of the mine. Of course, many of these prevention methods weren't used at Bengsihu, in part to save costs, and in part because the miners at Bengsihu were considered even more expendable than most early miners. The event at Bengzi has been listed by the Guinness Book of World Records as the worst coal mining disaster in terms of death toll. A very dark record for a company known to host bizarre joke records like most snails on a face or longest ear hair. Since then, many coal mines around the world have dried up. In the US alone, there are over 20,000 abandoned mines. Many of these mines had been worked for over a century and were deemed too unprofitable to continue.
The same shortage hit the UK coal industry as well, which led to protests, and eventually Britain began importing its coal. Meanwhile, other countries like Indonesia, Germany, and Russia have risen to become world-leading coal producers, while China also retains a large section of the industry. The US issued the Miner Act in 2006 to provide better emergency response plans for underground mines, and to provide new regulations for rescue teams. To avoid the premature closure of ventilation shafts like what happened in Banksy, this new act also regulated when and how areas can be sealed off. The act also encourages companies to improve safety for miners by introducing stiff penalties for infractions. China continues to invest in their coal production, with the industry increasing over 20% year over year. The government retains full control on mining rights and administration patterns for mineral extraction. But the country has increased prospecting rights from 3 to 5 years. China also invested $360 million into new gas management and work safety renovations. So it sounds like they're helping to make sure what happened at Banksy never happens again. Well, despite more opportunities for miners, China still accounts for almost 80% of the world's total coal miner fatalities, with a new accident occurring roughly once every week. A New York Times report showed that China has also been deploying Japan's tactic by covering up their mining accidents through their government-controlled press. It's even easier for the Chinese government to cover up their mining disasters because of the lack of independent trade unions in the country. What's even worse is China's incentive structure. The punishment for mining disasters is worse than the penalties for mismanaging the cleanup, so companies are pushed to cover up their mistakes and the deaths of more hard-working miners. How many unknown bones are buried in coal mines right now? Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, but the Titanic is far from the only major shipwreck in modern history. In fact, one of the worst shipwrecks is also one of the most recent. You may never have heard of it until now, but in 1991, a 300-foot passenger ship called the Salem Express sank with many hundreds of passengers on board, killing the vast majority of them. At around noon on Friday the 13th of December 1991, an unconfirmed number of people, at least hundreds and possibly well over 1,000, boarded the Salem Express at Jeddah Islamic Port in Saudi Arabia. While the date Friday the 13th might have seemed ominous to Westerners, the same superstition is not as widely held in the Middle East. In fact, many of those boarding the ship were in a celebratory mood. They had just returned from Mecca, the holiest city in the world for Muslims. Passengers were dressed in fine clothes, and many boarded the ship carrying gifts that they intended to bring home for family members. The mood on board is described as having been holiday-like. The ship set off from Jeddah Islamic Port to begin a 450-mile journey from Saudi Arabia to Egypt. To make this voyage, the Salem Express would travel northwest along the Red Sea, eventually arriving in the Egyptian port town of Safaja. The trip was expected to take around 36 hours. The Salem Express had been routinely making this journey for over 3 years, ever since 1988 when it was purchased by the Samator Shipping Company in Alexandria. Before it was used to make this regular voyage across the Red Sea, the ship had had quite a tumultuous history. It was built in France back in 1966. The original name of the ship was Fred Scamaroni, named after the French captain in World War II. At the very beginning of the ship's life, an unexpected disaster struck. Its first route was supposed to be from Marseille to the island of Corsica in the Mediterranean, but its launch was delayed because a fire broke out inside the ship's engine room. The fire was eventually extinguished, but not without it causing extensive damage. This damage ultimately delayed the ship's official launch by a total of 10 months. But despite the apparent bad omen, the ship was eventually put to work. It began sailing to and from Corsica on a regular basis. However, the French line, who owned the ship, soon began to wonder if they should have paid attention to the omen after all. Just months later, the ship crashed into the concrete platform where it was meant to dock at the port in Corsica. A year later, after being sold to new owners in France, it caught fire while sailing toward another port in Corsica. The ship changed ownership and changed its name a couple more times throughout the 1980s. It also survived more accidents and mishaps, including running aground and causing traffic jams. By December of 1991, the ship had gone through 6 different owners and had 5 different names. Before embarking on its December 13th voyage from Saudi Arabia to Egypt,
The ship, now called Salem Express, provided yet another ominous warning sign to its operators, this time in the form of a mechanical fault. The ship was originally supposed to leave on December 11th, but the fault caused a 2-day delay. But, as would seemingly happen time and again throughout the ship's troubled existence, the issue was eventually resolved and the journey resumed. Of the 36 hours that crew members and passengers spent aboard the Salem Express during that fateful December voyage, the first 35 of them went smoothly. By 11 p.m. on the night of Saturday the 14th, those on board were beginning to see the faint glow of Egypt's eastern shore off in the distance. However, conditions that night quickly turned stormy. Not only was the view less clear than usual, but the seas became much choppier. However, they were on the home stretch. The Salem Express was scheduled to arrive at its destination in mere minutes. Passengers were starting to collect their belongings and prepare to disembark. The captain of the ship was a man named Hassan Moreau. Moreau had been the ship's captain since it first began traversing the route from Saudi Arabia to Egypt in 1988, and he was highly familiar with the waters off the coast of Safaja where they now sailed. Concerned about the poor weather conditions, which were getting worse and worse by the minute, and relying on his familiarity with the area, Captain Moreau decided to deviate slightly from the normal route and attempt a shortcut. In essence, the shortcut Captain Moreau wanted to take was around a collection of reefs that obstruct ships from sailing directly into Safaja's port in a straight line from east to west. Normally, ships, including the Salem Express, would sail to the north, travel around the reefs, then sail south until they reached the port entrance on the other side. That night, as they approached the reefs, Captain Moreau instead decided to have the Salem Express steer left and head south. The plan was to pass the reefs around the opposite side. Moreau had reportedly taken this shortcut before. However, it's not clear whether he had ever attempted it during stormy weather conditions which he now was hoping to outmaneuver. Given his level of experience, there's no doubt Captain Moreau would have been aware of this, but there's a very good reason why ships don't normally take this southern shortcut. It is easy enough to recognize by simply looking at a map of the area. The reefs that obstruct the path to Safaja, almost like a kind of protective fortress, are not evenly arranged. They provide less space, both between each other and between the Egyptian shoreline at the bottom than at the top. This means that in order to take this shortcut, the captain needs to be even more precisely aware of the ship's location than usual. But instead of being more aware, Captain Moreau was actually less aware of precisely where he was sailing than he normally would be. Whether this was due to the poor weather conditions or something else, we may never know. But what we do know is that at that particular time, just a few miles off the coast of Safaja, the Salem Express was more than a full kilometer further east than anyone realized. Captain Moreau thought that they were sailing into the open space below a reef called Hindman Reef, but in reality the ship was sailing straight toward the reef. Captain Moreau, the crew, and the hundreds of passengers on board were notified of this error by a sudden eruption of noise and a dramatic rattling of the entire ship. The Salem Express had violently careened into the reef's southernmost section. The front right corner of the ship was instantly ripped open by the impact. So was a nearby door on the ship's bow. Together, this created a torrential flood of seawater to start crashing into the deck where passengers' cars were all parked. It didn't take long for everyone on board to realize something was seriously wrong. Within minutes following the impact, all the lights went out and the whole ship began to lean dramatically to the right. Water continued to fill in from the right-hand side, and the ship continued to lean further and further as hundreds of people on board found themselves cramped together in complete darkness. Passengers scrambled to get off the boat before the inevitable happened. Astoundingly, they would have a total of just 20 minutes to do so. 20 minutes after colliding with the reef, not much longer than the length of this video, the Salem Express was underwater. In the chaotic frenzy, only one lifeboat was successfully launched. Those who managed to escape the ship in time avoided sinking along with it, but were far from escaping danger. A woman named Hanan Salah, who worked as a nurse on the Salem Express, later told the LA Times about her experience as one of the few survivors that night. After floating in the midnight ocean waters, clinging to a wooden oar with another survivor for about 4 hours, the pair finally came across a life raft. They climbed aboard around 4 a.m., finding that the raft was full of water and dead bodies. They managed to survive in the life raft for another 3 hours before a wave flipped it over and dumped them back into the water. Salah then had the improbable luck of finding yet another wooden oar with a different survivor clinging to it, which she swam and began holding on to. She stayed there for another 4 or 5 hours until finally, in broad daylight the following morning, she was rescued by a tourist boat. Of those who managed to escape the ship in the 20 minutes prior to its sinking, many, if not most, ended up drowning in the water. But the vast majority of people on board, including Captain Morrow, failed to get off the ship due to the crowded frenzy and the insanely short window of time. The following week saw rescue operations carried out by the Egyptian Navy with additional help from both the US and Australia. The stormy weather conditions continued and didn't make the operation any easier. In total, 180 people survived and were successfully rescued. No small number, but unfortunately, a mere fraction of the total number of people who were on board that night. What followed was a recovery operation to extract bodies from inside the Salem Express, which was now lying on its side on the floor of the Red Sea. Many of the bodies were unable to be recovered, so the entryways were all welded shut, deliberately turning the sunken ship into a tomb. As a result, today, the true number of fatalities remains unknown. Estimates vary somewhat wildly, from a little over 450 to almost 1,000 dead. In the wake of the tragedy, the Egyptian authorities also gave conflicting reports about how many bodies had been recovered and how many passengers were initially on board. Today, the Salem Express is a well-known but very controversial destination for recreational divers. Even though the ship was welded shut at the main entry points in order to create a tomb for the dead still trapped inside, divers have discovered it is still possible to get inside the wreck from other smaller entry points. Compared to many shipwrecks, the Salem Express has not been underwater for very long. The level of preservation and the number of artifacts to be found make it very enticing for divers. Others decry its exploration and say the wreck should be left alone out of respect for the loss of life. Those who do explore the underwater wreckage of the Salem Express consistently say it is among the eeriest and most unsettling experiences they've ever had. Even highly experienced divers who have visited numerous well-known wrecks seem to agree that there's something uniquely haunting about the Salem Express. It might have something to do with how recently the ship went down. From cars, to suitcases, to portable stereos, the recent presence of human life is quite palpable. All the more so when you realize that many of the people themselves are effectively buried behind welded doors nearby. Permanent changes were made to the route from Jeddah to Safaja following the sinking of the Salem Express, barring all ships from taking the shortcut attempted by the late Captain Hassan Moreau. The site remains popular for diving to this day, and it also remains controversial for the same reason. While many who dive to explore the wreckage leave feeling unsettled, it has been reported that many of the divers who worked on the actual rescue mission were so traumatized by the horror of it all that they have since never strapped on diving gear again. We hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Tell us, had you heard of the Salem Express prior to watching this video? What are your thoughts on whether or not it should be used as a dive site today? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and please be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content like this in the near future. That's all for now. See you next time.